In a quiet suburb, Steve Curtis stumbles upon a devastating truth. A single photo exposes his wife, Barbara, locked in an embrace with another man, Raphael Leland Porter. Betrayal burns deep. Steve's rage erupts in a dramatic showdown at a park, where he rams Raphael's car into a river. Back home, he confronts Barbara, tearing apart their lives in front of her parents. The tension is electric. As secrets unravel, Steve must decide: fight for his marriage or walk away for good. The week before Christmas, Steve Curtis wore a forced smile as he accompanied his wife, Barbara, to a party with her co-workers. Their relationship had been strained for months, and Steve hoped the evening might improve things. But his hopes were dashed when Barbara's boss's nephew, Jimmy, squeezed in beside her at their table, monopolizing her attention. Barbara seemed to enjoy Jimmy's flattery, laughing and leaning in as they joked, while Steve sat silently, his frustration growing. Jimmy's smug comments and jokes, particularly one mocking Steve's job as a construction worker, pushed Steve to his limit. "I live in a mobile home," Steve stated quietly but firmly, his anger barely contained. He defended the hard-working men and women who couldn't afford luxurious homes, unlike Jimmy, who had the privilege of a wealthy uncle. Steve's words stunned Jimmy, who wasn't used to being challenged. Before tensions could escalate further, an older man in an expensive suit intervened. Introducing himself as Jonas Reynolds, he praised Steve's integrity and shared a personal connection to humble beginnings. As Reynolds directed Jimmy to leave, Steve felt uneasy, realizing Reynolds was likely Barbara's employer. Despite the awkwardness, Steve remained composed, but the evening left him more uncertain about his marriage. Jimmy stood up, his chair scraping loudly as he stormed off, his ears burning red with embarrassment. The table fell silent, all eyes following him. Jonas watched him leave, then turned to Steve. "Family is important, but sometimes things just don't work out," he said thoughtfully, before shaking Steve's hand again. Standing tall over the shorter CEO, Steve listened as Jonas assured him, "Not all Reynolds are like Jimmy. Barbara is valuable to us, and we don't want to lose her because of this." Jonas then addressed the group, apologizing for the interruption and encouraging them to enjoy the evening. As he left, the atmosphere slowly lightened and conversations resumed. Steve received quiet pats on the shoulder from other guests, but Barbara remained silent, her mood darkening as the night wore on. Once home, Barbara's anger erupted. "Did you have to embarrass me in front of everyone? You always put my friends down," she accused. Steve, taken aback, quickly turned defensive. "Excuse me? You made a fool of yourself. You were flirting with him all night," he shot back. Barbara, defensive, argued that Jimmy was just being friendly, but Steve wasn't buying it. "What were you going to do next? Sit on his lap?" he asked coldly. Barbara, flushed with anger, retorted sarcastically, "Maybe I will next time. At least Jimmy knows how to treat a woman." Steve stared at her, a cold realization washing over him. "Barbara, you let another man disrespect me right in front of you," he said quietly. "I stayed calm because of you, but any other time, I would have dealt with him." He stepped closer, his voice steady. "If I had reacted, I would have had to address your behavior too. We both know that." The tension between them was palpable, the silence heavy. Finally, Steve asked, "Do you want a divorce?" Barbara's eyes widened, but she collected herself and spoke carefully. Steve's response was firm. "The next time you take another man's side against me or act like someone else matters more, that's the day I'll consider ending this marriage." Barbara walked away, leaving Steve feeling drained and defeated. The slam of the bedroom door echoed through the house. Finding it locked, Steve thought about sleeping on the couch, but a sudden surge of frustration overcame him. Steve pressed his back against the wall, took a step, and shoved the door open, startling Barbara. She instinctively raised her arms defensively. Steve, surprised by her reaction, asked, "What's wrong with you? I didn't hurt you before, and I'm not going to now." He calmly walked to the closet, changing his clothes with deliberate care. Barbara, voice trembling, said, "I don't want to sleep with you." Steve scoffed, replying, "Fine, but I did nothing wrong, you did. I'm sleeping in my bed tonight. If you don't want to, the spare sheets and blankets are in the closet." Barbara stayed silent. Steve ignored her as she quietly left the room. He felt the loneliness in bed without her, taking hours to finally fall asleep. He woke briefly when Barbara returned, staying as far from him as possible. He turned away and drifted back to sleep. In mid-June, Steve discovered his wife's affair in the most unexpected way, through a newspaper. He rarely read print news, preferring online or TV updates. But while waiting at the dentist's office, he picked up a newspaper to pass the time. Skipping through the sports section and avoiding society news, he casually flipped to a section marked with a big C. There, he saw a photo from a recent social event, featuring his wife smiling at another man. The man's arm was positioned too close to Barbara, implying something more intimate. Steve's heart sank. A dark, heavy feeling washed over him as the paper slipped from his hands. His surroundings blurred and he felt numb, moving robotically as the dental assistant called him in. Steve went through the motions of the dental appointment, barely aware of his surroundings. Afterward, he wandered the parking garage, struggling to remember where he'd parked. When he finally found his truck, he sat in it, not moving, until he forced himself to start the engine. The powerful roar echoed through the garage, but Steve barely registered it, lost in his thoughts. In the rearview mirror, he noticed an angry man getting into a fancy car nearby, but it didn't matter. Nothing did. The man shot an annoyed glance at Steve before driving off. Realizing his foot was still on the gas, Steve forced himself to ease up. Everything felt overwhelming now. His life had changed so much, and he was drowning in sadness and frustration. He had sensed something was wrong before, with the Christmas party being a clear warning sign. But Barbara had been pulling away even before that. After the party, they had a big fight, and Steve tried harder to show his love. He left small gifts, sent flowers, and wrote sweet emails, hoping to close the growing gap between them. For a while, things seemed to improve. Barbara apologized around Valentine's Day, and they enjoyed a brief period of warmth in their marriage. But in late March, Steve had to go on a business trip to Washington, which ended up lasting 3 weeks. When he returned, Barbara was cold and distant, uninterested in fixing their relationship. The connection they had begun to rebuild was gone. Steve's efforts to understand what was wrong were met with indifference, and one day, Barbara told him she was tired of his controlling ways and needed space. Steve began to suspect she might be seeing someone else, but the blurry newspaper photo wasn't enough proof. He needed more details. Driving aimlessly, he called his brother John, barely holding back tears as he confessed, "I think Barbara is cheating on me." John, always the louder one, immediately focused on helping. Steve explained about the photo and asked if John could get a clearer copy. John assured him he could, thanks to a contact at the newspaper who owed him a favor. Steve felt a small sense of relief, knowing someone was on his side. John promised to check and get back to him. A few days later, John brought a large envelope to Steve at the construction site. The familiar setting of the trailer offered some comfort to Steve, who managed a small smile as John's presence lightened the heavy mood, if only briefly. John shook Steve's hand at the sidewalk and invited him over for dinner soon. As night fell, the construction site quieted down, leaving only Steve and 3 security guards. Steve had a .45 gun in a holster on his desk, ready to clip to his belt before leaving. Construction sites could be dangerous at night. After a busy afternoon, Steve finally opened the envelope John had brought. Inside were 3 photos from a mansion party. Barbara was in each one, though never the main focus. The first unedited photo showed a man pulling Barbara closer. Steve clenched his teeth, trying to stay calm. The second photo revealed Barbara with her arm around the man's waist, his hand resting on her back. The third picture was the most damning. The man was leaning in close, and his hand was inside Barbara's skirt. Steve's anger boiled over and he let out a scream, but he knew he had to keep control. Slowly, he forced himself to calm down, though the pain of betrayal was intense. It was clear this affair had been ongoing, or the man had moved quickly and Barbara was complicit. Steve realized there was nothing left but to face the end of his marriage. Just as he resolved to call a lawyer the next day, his phone vibrated. It was John. Steve answered, and John revealed he had identified the man in the photos, Raphael Leland Porter, an executive at Harper Insurance. Steve's heart raced as he wrote down the details. Raphael was married with a 6-year-old daughter, and though Barbara was to blame, Steve wanted Raphael to face consequences too. After getting all the information, Steve thanked John and ended the call, feeling a mix of anger and determination. This wasn't all the information Steve wanted about the man with Barbara, but it was a solid start. He knew he needed more and had a plan. Private investigators came in many forms, from flashy TV-style operatives to seasoned professionals with backgrounds in law enforcement or military investigations. Steve wanted a true professional, someone who could dig deep. With recommendations from his company's head of security, a former VIP protection officer, Steve compiled a list of reputable agencies. He chose one specializing in electronic surveillance and was relieved to find the office looked like any normal business. The first meeting went well. The investigator, a skilled and decorated professional, asked detailed questions and reviewed his case thoroughly. "Mr. Curtis," she said, "most of this information is available through public records, like at the courthouse or a reverse street address directory." Steve knew some of it was accessible, but he wanted more, details that wouldn't be found in public files. And he was willing to pay for a comprehensive report. Steve had already separated his finances from Barbara's, securing funds she couldn't touch. This decision, among others, had led to several misunderstandings between them over the past few months. But now, he was determined to find out everything he could. 2 days later, the investigator delivered phone numbers, email addresses, and detailed information about the Porter's vehicles and home. The report, a 3-inch binder full of data, took Steve 2 days to review. As he combed through the details, his anger simmered, but he managed to stay focused. He couldn't wait to confront Barbara with what he had discovered, eager to see her reaction when she realized he wasn't as clueless as she thought. As lunchtime approached, Steve headed to Barbara's office, ready to ask her to join him. It was time for Steve to confront Barbara. As he pulled into the parking lot, he spotted a silver Ford Thunderbird leaving, Raphael Porter's car. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. Steve quickly chased after it, his heart racing as he ran 2 red lights to catch up. He needed confirmation, so at the next red light, he used his camcorder to zoom in. It was Barbara, smiling and waving at the man beside her. Steve trailed them to a park by the river, where they parked under some trees. He positioned his truck behind a storage building, carefully recording them as they talked. But when Barbara tossed something onto the dashboard, Steve's anger boiled over. Without thinking, he started his truck, drove around the building, and rammed the Thunderbird. He didn't stop, pushing the car down a hill and into the slow-moving stream. Their screams fueled his rage, and for the first time in a week, he smiled, a cold, bitter smile. After the car was nearly submerged, Steve backed his truck out of the river, parked, and propped the camcorder on the dashboard to record the aftermath. He stepped out to watch as Barbara and Porter crawled out of the sinking car, coughing and covered in mud. Steve ignored Porter's shouts and focused on Barbara, who looked up in panic when she recognized him. "Rafe!" she screamed. "Oh God, it's my husband!" Porter, cursing, started towards Steve but froze when Barbara yelled, "He's got a gun!" Steve's hand instinctively went to the grip of his gun, but he didn't draw it. If he had wanted to use it, he would have already. Instead, he stared at the two of them, soaked and filthy, and felt nothing but disgust. The only sound was the water and the cooling engine. "Barbara," Steve said, making her jump. His voice was calm but firm. "Don't come home. Go to your parents or somewhere else, but stay away from me. Understand?" Barbara, drenched and scared, nodded as the reality of her situation sank in. Steve looked at her one last time, disgust clear on his face, before turning to Raphael Porter. "Mr. Porter," he said loudly, making sure he was heard. Steve wanted Raphael to know he recognized him. "You can call the cops if you want," Steve told him. "They'll take me away, but you won't like what happens when I get out. I promise you that." Raphael, feeling genuine fear for the first time in years, remained silent, his eyes fixed on Steve's gun. Steve turned and walked back to his truck, taking one last look at the wet and muddy pair, his face filled with contempt, before driving away. Barbara started yelling for him to come back, but Steve just shook his head and kept going. His life with her was over. She was someone else's problem now. For the rest of the week, Steve expected the police to show up every time he got into his truck. But by the second day, when no one came, he began to feel a bit more at ease. Despite his threats to Raphael, he knew he had no real defense if charges were pressed. To prepare, he visited a tough lawyer his brother recommended. By Friday, Steve had changed the locks and packed most of Barbara's belongings into boxes, stacking them in the garage. He left one box open for items he kept finding around the house. Barbara had called him several times over the past few days, but Steve ignored the calls. When his father-in-law, Lloyd, finally called, Steve decided to answer. "Hello, Lloyd," Steve said softly, catching Lloyd off guard. After an awkward pause, Lloyd apologized for what was happening and asked Steve to come over to talk. Steve declined, but invited them to his house instead, adding that they should bring a van to collect Barbara's things. When his in-laws arrived with Barbara, she immediately noticed the changes Steve had made in the house. Her lips tightened at every missing picture and trinket. Steve greeted his father-in-law with a handshake and nodded to his mother-in-law, Diane, but there was no warmth between them. The only person Steve was glad to see was Barbara's grandmother, Lydia. He greeted her with genuine warmth, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. Steve glanced outside, wondering if another member of Barbara's family might be there. "Is Kimberly coming?" he asked. Lloyd shook his head. "She's still at her college prep course in Austin. I wouldn't have brought her anyway. This isn't something she needs to be part of." Steve shrugged. "I'm not sure you need to be part of this either, Lloyd," he said kindly, agreeing with his father-in-law. Barbara and her parents settled on the couch, while Lydia made herself comfortable on the love seat, smiling at Steve as she adjusted her legs. Steve sat in the lazy boy facing them and waited for someone to speak. His eyes were on Barbara, who shifted uneasily under his gaze. As he looked at her, he realized that despite being married for 4 years and knowing her for 6, he didn't really know her at all. Barbara was attractive, with tall, slender legs, brown hair with hints of red, and green eyes. She had a few freckles on her nose and cheeks, and her beauty was more about the combination of her features than any one thing. But as Steve looked at her now, he recognized that his love for her had been fading for a long time. Turning to Lloyd, Steve raised his eyebrows, signaling him to start. Lloyd spoke awkwardly. "Barbara told us about you seeing her and Mr. Porter at the park. We think you might have misunderstood what was happening." Steve glanced at Barbara, who was sitting up straight. "Okay," he said. "What were you doing with Mr. Raphael Porter, or what did you tell your parents you were doing?" "I told them the truth," Barbara snapped, struggling to keep her anger in check. Steve smiled softly, though his eyes remained cold. He motioned for her to continue. Barbara took a deep breath. "I'm sorry you misunderstood, Steve. It's really simple, and you shouldn't have reacted the way you did." Steve raised his hand to stop her. "Don't call me that," he said firmly. "You lost the right to do that." Barbara's lips tightened in anger, but she controlled herself and nodded. "Whatever you say," she replied calmly, trying to keep the peace. She explained that what Steve saw was innocent, that Rafe was having trouble in his marriage, and she was helping him by offering a woman's perspective. "Rafe is just a good friend," she insisted with a tentative smile. Steve looked at her silently, sensing that her story was rehearsed. "How did you meet Mr. Porter?" he finally asked. Barbara hadn't expected that question, and it showed. "Before you answer," Steve added, "if you want to save this marriage, don't lie. Do you understand?" After a moment, she nodded. Steve gestured for her to continue. "He works in the same building as me," Barbara said. "We met in the cafeteria downstairs and just started talking one day." She added, "Actually, you'd like him if you weren't always so upset." Steve chose not to respond to that, taking a deep breath to calm down. "So you met at the restaurant in the lobby of your building, and you've been helping him with his marriage, right?" he asked. Barbara nodded. "And there was no affair?" Steve asked. She shook her head. "No." "Any inappropriate behavior?" he pressed. "No," Barbara replied firmly. Steve stared at her in silence, the tension thick. Her father coughed, trying to ease it. "So, Steve, maybe you misunderstood what Barbara was doing. I'm not saying she should have been helping him without telling you, but it wasn't what you thought." Steve glanced at Barbara's father, feeling a bit sorry for him. Then, reaching for a thick binder from the magazine rack, he said, You might have forgotten, but my brother John is the news director at the Fox station. High-profile people have files at news organizations, and I also hired a private investigator. This is their report." Barbara's eyes widened in shock, her anxiety growing. Steve continued, "Mr. Raphael Porter is a well-known manager at Harper Insurance. He's had some career issues lately, but might turn things around. His office is in the Lowry building downtown, over 13 miles from your office, Barbara. Quite a distance to drive just for a lunch to help him with his marriage, don't you think?" Steve pretended to read more from the report, noticing the worried expressions of his in-laws and the growing anxiety in Barbara. Her grandmother, Lydia, voiced her disapproval softly. Steve then pulled out 3 photos from the binder and placed them on the coffee table. Barbara flinched as she saw them. "Look, Lloyd, Diane," Steve said in a measured tone. "Here's my wife at a party at a mansion. She told me she was shopping in Austin that day." He pointed to the first photo. "Notice Mr. Raphael Porter's hand on her waist. That doesn't seem right, does it?" Lloyd swallowed hard, looking at his daughter but unable to find the words. Steve placed the second photo next to the first. "Here's another one from that same party. Remember when I asked Barbara about no kissing? Well, this picture contradicts that, wouldn't you say?" He pointed to Barbara and Porter's heads, making it clear what was happening. Finally, Steve placed the third photo on the table. "This one's quite interesting, isn't it? You can see how well my wife is helping Raphael with his problems. He looks pretty happy, wouldn't you agree?" Barbara, now desperate, shouted, "No! He wasn't doing anything wrong like that! I told him to stop!" But as she looked around, she realized no one believed her. Steve, with a sharp tone, asked, "Barbara, can you tell us why he feels he can act this way towards you? What's going on that makes him think this is okay?" Barbara stammered, "It's not what it looks like, Lydia interrupted, "Barbara, you're not helping yourself." Diane, furious, snapped at her mother, "You said you wouldn't get involved." Lydia shrugged, leaning back, unconcerned. Barbara's face showed a hint of defiance as she gathered herself. "Okay, I admit it," she said boldly. "I should have made him stop. But look at those pictures. We were in a public place. It's not like we were meeting in a hotel or something." Her voice softened as she realized she might be leading to further misunderstandings, remembering their time at the park where there were no cameras. "Steve, I'm sorry for how this looks," Barbara said sincerely. "But we don't need to get too worked up about it. You saw us at the park, right? We were just talking. You saw that, didn't you?" She was confident there was no proof beyond his suspicions. "Really, Barbara?" Steve asked gently. "Nothing happened?" He picked up a remote and turned on the TV, then grabbed another for his camcorder, which was ready to play. No one had noticed it sitting next to the cable box. Steve stared hard at Barbara as he pressed the play button on the big TV. The video showed the Thunderbird already in the water, the camera bouncing as Steve's truck backed up. The sound of the engine roared through the room until Steve lowered the volume. When the truck stopped, everyone heard a door slam. The camera captured Steve walking into view and stepping closer to the stream. Suddenly, Barbara tumbled out of the passenger window and splashed into the dark water, followed by a man who joined her, both covered in mud. Barbara struggled to stay steady, waving her arms, but she lost her balance and fell into a deeper part of the water before regaining her footing and pulling her purse from the water. Steve paused the video and rewound it. "Pretty interesting film, right, Barbara?" he asked softly. "You shouldn't have done that," Barbara snapped, angry and upset at seeing herself in that vulnerable moment. "You didn't have the right to do this," she said sharply. "Rafe and I weren't doing anything But she stopped as she realized Steve wasn't paying attention, focused instead on adjusting the video. "Now here," Steve said, pointing with a laser at the screen, "you can see Barbara's hand up in the air." He zoomed in on a blurry part of the image. Lydia made a sound of disapproval, but Steve ignored it, continuing to rewind and pause at key moments. "And here you can see my wife and Rafe in a close position," he added, showing the two figures with their arms around each other in the car's back window. "Oh, Barbara," Lloyd said, his voice filled with disappointment. "Daddy?" Barbara cried, shocked by her father's reaction. Steve continued narrating. "You can see my wife kind of leans down and then comes back up." He paused the video at the moment Barbara tossed something white towards the dashboard. "See that?" he asked, though no one responded. They had all seen it. He kept his eyes on Barbara, his voice growing harsher as he explained, "What you just saw was my wife throwing something towards the dashboard." He zoomed in on the image, making it clear what she was holding. Barbara began to cry quietly on the couch. Steve played the tape forward to the moment she retrieved her purse from the water, stopping it when her skirt was pulled up. "I guess Barbara didn't realize her skirt was pulled up that high when she got out of the car," he remarked coldly. The video clearly showed her skirt hiked up, and as Steve let the video run for a few more seconds, he added, "Notice that my wife's shirt was not properly fastened that day." He paused the video, letting the image speak for itself as Barbara's shirt clung to her wet body. Steve said nothing more. Steve rewound the tape one last time, stopping at the moment another person climbed out of the car window. Without saying anything, he turned off the camera. The silence spoke louder than any words. "So, Barbara," Steve said, "you weren't acting inappropriately?" Lloyd, overwhelmed, held his head in his hands, unable to look. Diane cleared her throat, unsure of what to say. "I didn't do anything with him," Barbara said, her voice shaky. "I didn't." "Well, not this time anyway," Steve replied coldly. "I didn't give you the chance, did I? Stop trying to convince me and everyone else. You went to the park with this guy. You took off your things for him, and you were about to cross a line. You would have if I hadn't been there." Barbara sobbed as her mother awkwardly tried to comfort her. "I never did anything with him," Barbara whispered. "I might have that day. I was confused. I didn't really want to, but he said it would be okay. I didn't want to do anything with him." She pulled away from her mother's embrace. "You caught me, Steve," Barbara said more firmly. "You won't believe it, but I'm glad you did. I was getting involved in something I really didn't want to be part of." Steve's loud, dismissive snort cut her off. "How many times did you go too far with him?" Steve asked harshly. Barbara shook her head. "I told you I never did," she insisted. "That's not true," Steve shot back. "That man was acting inappropriately, and you were hardly dressed. That doesn't happen on a first date. How many times were you with him?" Steve demanded again. Barbara, refusing to look at him, shook her head once more. "Steve," Lloyd said carefully, "they really didn't go that far. You made sure of that, right? The other pictures aren't great, but they weren't crossing any serious lines at that party. Can't we all step back and figure this out? Couples have worked through things like this before. You and Barbara can too." Steve stared at his father-in-law, emotionless. "Lloyd, you're acting like Barbara did something small. You think a simple sorry will fix everything? But she's not a little girl anymore, and she can't fix this marriage just by saying sorry." He stood up and began pacing. "She's been dishonest, telling me she was going places she wasn't, saying she wasn't doing anything wrong. She even lied to you, Lloyd. I'm starting to think our whole marriage has been a lie from the start." Suddenly, Steve turned to Barbara. "Did you make up some story to tell Elaine Porter?" he asked, catching her off guard. "No. What?" Barbara stammered, confused. "Elaine," Steve clarified, "is Mrs. Porter. I wonder what their daughter will think of her father now." Barbara slumped, crying again, but Steve was unmoved by her tears. "Now you care?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Okay. What did he tell his wife about being with a married woman?" "I don't know," Barbara said defensively. "I haven't talked to him since the day you saw us." "You haven't talked to him, seen him, called him, texted him, emailed him?" Steve pressed. Barbara shook her head firmly. Steve walked over to the table near the front door, rifled through Barbara's purse, and pulled out her phone. "Hey!" Barbara shouted, desperate. "You can't do that! You can't just go through my stuff!" "Shut up!" Steve yelled. "You lost all your rights to privacy in my house when you decided to cheat on me!" The intensity in his eyes made her sit back down, burying her face in her hands as she cried again. Steve held up a sheet of paper from the investigator's binder, showing it to Lloyd. "See this?" he said, pointing to the phone screen. "This is Barbara's call list. It shows the last few calls. You see those at the top? 4 calls to Raphael Porter's cell number and 2 to his home phone. The next 3 calls were to his office. You can see what's happening, right? All of these were made yesterday except the top 2. Barbara made those calls this morning. Heck, Lloyd, she called him just half an hour before you got here. She just told us she hadn't talked to him since the day I caught them together. More lies, Steve snapped, tossing the phone toward the front door. Do you really think I can ever trust this woman again, Lloyd? Lloyd lowered his head, biting his lip, knowing there was nothing he could say to change Steve's mind. Steve, Barbara said in a flat voice, please, I made a mistake, but I can fix it. I promise I won't talk to him again, I won't. Steve didn't look at her. Overreact? He repeated, incredulous. My wife has been talking to another man and I'm not supposed to overreact? He yelled the last word, furious at her attempts to downplay what she had done. Turning away, Steve tried to calm down, but Barbara's quiet voice reached him from behind. Please, she begged softly. I know you're upset, but I will never do this again. Let me come home and I promise I'll... You don't live here anymore, Steve cut her off. A fire sparked in Barbara's eyes. This is just as much my house as it is yours, she shot back. Her parents looked ready to jump into the argument. Steve glanced at Lydia, who had been sitting quietly. Did you ever tell them? He asked. Lydia shook her head. I never thought it would matter, she replied. What do you mean? Diane asked, suspicious. When Lydia gave me the title to this house, Steve explained in a low voice, she only put my name on it. I didn't notice until a year after Barbara and I got married. Lydia never changed it, even when I asked. I own this house, not Barbara. The room fell silent. Barbara and her parents stared at Lydia, who remained unbothered. Oh well, she said, offering no further explanation. Mother, Nanny, Lydia. The older woman stood up and walked toward the door. What's done is done. Nobody can change the past. All you can do is make the best of it and move on. I think we've all said what we came here to say, haven't we? Lydia asked. Lloyd nodded and got up, with Diane and Barbara following her lead. Lloyd looked back at Steve, half apologizing with a shake of his head before heading outside. Once they were off the porch, Steve shut the door firmly and leaned against it. Move on, he whispered. No, I'm sorry, Lydia, but there's no moving on from this. Not this time. The rest of the weekend was calm. Steve spent Sunday working on the back deck and cleaning the hot tub, keeping busy to distract himself. In the evening, he took some of Barbara's things to her parents' house, leaving the boxes in the driveway. As he drove away, he thought he saw Lloyd's car but didn't care enough to check. By Tuesday, the phone calls started again. Barbara called 3 times and her parents called once each. Steve ignored Barbara's calls but returned those from Lloyd and Diane. By Thursday, he had 18 messages waiting for him, all pleading for forgiveness and urging him to move on. Steve, Lloyd's voice came through the phone. Steve, exhausted, hadn't checked the caller ID. Have you thought about everything? Barbara is upset and Diane and I were hoping you could sit down and talk with her soon. No, Lloyd. I haven't had time to think and it wouldn't make a difference. Barbara chose to be unfaithful and this time it's final. Oh, Steve, his father-in-law said sadly. I was hoping you could find a way to get past this. Steve felt a surge of anger at the suggestion that he was being unreasonable but held back. No, Lloyd, I won't get over this, and I don't see why you think I should. Think about it, Lloyd. How would you feel if Diane started seeing another man? Would you want to see your wife with someone else? Is that something you'd like to go through? Steve asked. Lloyd paused before answering. No, I wouldn't like it. But if I stopped it before it became a real problem, I think I'd work with her to fix things. Silence hung between them. Then Lloyd hesitantly added, Steve, don't you think you're overreacting a bit? Steve clenched his jaw, counting to 10 as his mother had taught him. Lloyd, he said softly, if I hear the word overreacting one more time, I might lose it. I'm just warning you so you can stay clear when it happens. There was no response. Look, Lloyd, I'm tired. It's been a long day and I need to sleep. Please don't call me again tonight, okay? Sure, Steve. Sorry, I didn't realize how late it was. Get some sleep. Have a good day tomorrow, all right? I will, Lloyd. Thanks. Good night. Steve was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. That word, overreacting, echoed in his mind. He knew what he had seen, and there was no overreacting to that. Barbara was still in contact with Porter, and it bothered him deeply. He didn't have proof, but his gut told him she was still talking to Porter, maybe even meeting him. He had been planning something for a week, and now it was time to act. He pulled out the binder from the private investigator and spent 2 hours meticulously writing down all the information. He knew he'd feel the loss of sleep tomorrow, but tonight, it was worth it. Overreact, he muttered to himself, laughing quietly. Let's see how people respond to this. The next morning, Barbara was reeling from the shock of receiving divorce papers from Steve the day before. She felt sad, confused, and lost, having spent a sleepless night trying to understand how her life had come to this point. Her mind was a mess, and she was barely functioning. On her way to work, she realized her car's gas tank was nearly empty and stopped at a gas station. It had been so long since she'd done this, Steve used to handle these things for her, that she had to read the instructions to use her credit card properly. Flustered, she messed up several times before finally managing to pump the gas. She couldn't help but wish Steve would come to his senses so everything could go back to normal. After all, she hadn't really done anything wrong with Rafe. He had been respectful and promised to take things slowly. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she might have made different choices if given the chance. Rafe was still upset about Steve's confrontation, feeling that Steve had overreacted. He hadn't called the police or taken any legal action, though he had considered suing Steve. Barbara was left feeling confused and overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Her life felt out of control, and she was struggling with even the smallest tasks. By the time she arrived at work, she was late and stressed. The morning felt off, and when she reached the 6th floor, she noticed everyone seemed to be staring at her. The scrutiny was unnerving, especially after Steve's actions the previous week. "Hi, Barb," Tom greeted her, glancing over her shoulder. "No one with you today?" His tone was calm, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled her. "Hi. No, not today," she replied, puzzled. She noticed a few other coworkers watching her, including 2 women she didn't get along with who were smiling strangely. The unease settled in her stomach. Something wasn't right. Barbara gave Tom one last look before walking away. "Hello, Barb," Katie said, passing by quickly. "You're all by yourself today." Unlike Tom, Katie didn't stop to chat, just tossed the comment over her shoulder as she walked away. Barbara felt a growing unease. Something strange was happening, but she couldn't pinpoint what. Suddenly, June appeared beside her, urging her to follow. "Come on, don't talk, just come," June said, pulling her along before Barbara could protest. Barbara disliked being rushed. It felt disrespectful. She noticed her skirt riding up and wished she'd worn a longer one, but most of her longer skirts were still at the dry cleaners. This skirt, a gift from Rafe, usually made her uncomfortable, but today felt different. Rafe's suggestions often overwhelmed her. June hurried Barbara into her tiny cubicle, sat her down at the computer, and took a deep breath. "Barb, I don't know what's going on, but this email went out to everyone in the building." June clicked on a message with a chilling subject line. "Have you seen this man and woman?" She scrolled down so Barbara could read it. The email read, "Have you seen this man and woman? They are both cheating on their spouses and have been for a long time. If you see Barbara Curtis and Raphael Porter together, please call the number below to report when and where you saw them. All calls will be confidential." Below the text were side-by-side photos of Barbara and Raphael, along with the home phone number she had shared with Steve for the past 4 years. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," Barbara moaned, feeling lost and overwhelmed. She looked up and saw Bill, a tall, skinny coworker, peering over the partition. He pretended to be looking around, checking a paper, but it was clear he was aware of the situation. Barbara pulled out her phone and dialed her home number, fighting back tears as she waited for the call to connect. The phone rang, and then Steve's voice came on the answering machine. "Hi, you have reached the Infidelity hotline," Steve's voice said coldly. "If you have seen Raphael Porter with Barbara Curtis, please stay on the line. Your call is very important to us. At the beep, please tell us the date, time, location, and what you saw about these 2 people together. Remember, your information is completely anonymous. No one will come to your home. Thank you." Barbara heard the beep and froze. Her mind went blank and she hung up. She quickly dialed another number, desperate to talk to someone else. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice trembling. Meanwhile, Steve heard the phone ringing but chose to ignore it. He had already received 28 calls, most of which were either jokes or cruel comments questioning his ability to keep his wife from leaving him. These calls frustrated him, but he let them go. As the answering machine picked up the latest call, Steve stopped typing on his laptop to listen. The voice was soft and tired, full of hidden emotion. "Is anyone there?" she asked, then added, "I'm calling about the email. I don't know what is going on." A chill ran down Steve's back as he recognized the voice. He picked up the phone. "Mrs. Porter?" he said softly. "Yes, who is this?" she replied, her voice rough. "I'm Steve Curtis," he said. "I'm sorry for how you found out about this, Mrs. Porter." He felt a pang of guilt for not considering her feelings before sending the email, but his focus had been on revealing the truth. "Is it true?" she whispered. "You've seen them together or something?" Steve took a deep breath. "Yes, ma'am," he said gently. "I have photos from a party a few weeks ago and a video from when I saw them at City View Park last week." "The park? But that's where my husband's car got wrecked in a hit and run," she said. Steve scoffed. "No, ma'am. I just talked to him there." She was silent for a long time. "Can I see the pictures or the video?" she asked, her voice even softer. "Yes, Mrs. Porter, you can see them. Do you have an email address I can send them to?" he asked. She gave him her business email, explaining that she checked it often from home. Steve sent the photos. Moments later, he heard the familiar sound of a new email arriving on the other end of the line. He waited, listening to the rapid clicks of a mouse, followed by the sound of quiet sobbing. Regret washed over him as he realized the pain he had caused. He questioned whether sending that email had been the right thing to do. "Mrs. Porter?" he called out, hoping to offer some comfort or at least apologize again. "Yes, I'm here," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Curtis. I've had my suspicions for months, but it's still hard to face when you can't ignore it anymore," she said, her voice trembling. Steve hesitated, unsure of what to say or how to console her. "Mr. Curtis?" she asked, sounding a bit stronger. "Yes, ma'am," he responded. "You mentioned a video. Can I see it?" "Yeah, I have about 10 minutes of footage from the park," Steve replied. "Could I see it?" she asked softly. "Sure. Do you mean tonight?" he asked hesitantly. "Well, I don't want to impose," she said, uncertain. "No, it's not that," Steve clarified. "I just want to make sure I understand. We're in a tough spot and I don't want to make it worse. I'm new to this too." "That's fine, Mr. Curtis," she said after a pause. "I feel the same way. I'm embarrassed about what my husband has done to your marriage and I don't know what to say either." "Well, for one thing, ma'am, your husband and my wife are both responsible. As my grandma used to say, it takes two to tango. So don't feel bad. It wasn't you, Mrs. Porter." "Please, call me Elaine," she said, her voice steadier. "Sure, Elaine. And I'm Steve, okay?" They talked a bit longer, deciding on a quiet cafe where they could meet and discuss everything openly. They met late, long after dinner, in a nearly empty cafe that would only get busy when the clubs closed later in the night. Steve showed her the video still saved on his camera, reminding himself that he needed to find someone to help him turn it into a DVD. After the emails were sent, things grew tense. Calls from Lloyd, Diane, and Barbara became increasingly difficult to handle. Barbara had taken an extended leave from her job, feeling bullied and uncomfortable. Soon, she would have to either return to work or take unpaid leave, a situation that only fueled her anger and frustration. Lloyd and Diane peppered Steve with questions until he couldn't take it anymore, eventually cutting off all communication with Barbara and her family, except for Barbara's grandmother, Lydia. "Hey, young man," Lydia said cheerfully when she called. "How are you doing?" "Hi, Lydia, I'm good. How about you?" Steve replied, smiling as he recognized her voice on the caller ID. He was always happy to hear from her. "Pretty good for an old woman," Lydia said with a laugh, her favorite line. Steve chuckled, enjoying the familiar banter. "I'm glad to hear it," he said warmly. They chatted about small things and big things before Lydia got to the point. "Well, you've sure caused a stir in the Montgomery house, haven't you?" she said directly. Steve shrugged, though she couldn't see it. "I know, Lydia. Some of it was my fault, and some of it just had to be done." "You had to do what you did," Lydia said, surprising him. "You're the first to say that," Steve admitted. "Lloyd and Diane don't agree." "They don't, but I don't let that bother me," Lydia replied. "It was clear to me that Barbara wasn't going to change her mind without a push. I don't mean she was seriously dating him, but I'm sure he told her you were being unfair, that it was wrong to kick her out. I wanted to tell her off so bad I was about to burst, Lydia said, making Steve laugh. Anyway, Lydia continued, after your email, he called Barbara and told her he didn't want to talk to her or hear from her anymore. His wife is keeping him in check. How did Barbara take that? Steve asked after a pause. She didn't like it at all, Lydia said with a giggle. Her dad and Diane have been giving her a hard time every day. She thought Rafe was her only friend, and when he cut ties, she was left alone with her thoughts, and she didn't like what she was hearing. They didn't tell me any of that, Steve replied. All I've heard is how I should save the marriage, how I'm making things worse, how sorry Barbara is, and so on. Yeah, I know, Lydia said kindly. I had the bad luck to hear some of those calls too. But what they say to you and what they say to her are two different things, Lydia remarked. Steve considered her words. Well, they have to support Barbara. She's their daughter after all, that makes sense. Yep, Lydia agreed. But guess who her best friend is now? Steve paused, then finally said, Oh, me? Definitely, Lydia laughed. So now I get to chat with both of you and pass along messages from your wife. Isn't that great? She added, her tone suddenly taking on a playful, refined accent. Steve couldn't help but laugh. Lydia had a way of switching from her natural South Texas drawl to a more polished tone, surprising those who didn't know her well. Well, I don't have any messages for her today, Lydia, he said, still chuckling. But she has one for you, Lydia said quickly. Steve's laughter faded. What is it? He asked flatly. Don't you use that tone with me, young man, Lydia replied, slipping back into her South Texas accent. That's not nice. Steve sighed. I'm sorry, Lydia, it's just... You're poking at something that hurts, you know. I always said you were smart, Lydia said, her voice now more thoughtful. Some people think you're quiet, but I know you like to watch others make fools of themselves. She paused before adding, Steve, you and Barbara would be a great couple if you could work together. I won't stop hoping for that until I've tried everything I can think of. You hear me, young man? I hear you, Lydia, Steve replied seriously. But I think it's pointless. Your granddaughter has hurt me too much, and I can't build a life with someone who would do that. I understand, son, Lydia said gently. There was a long pause before she added, Well, I'll hang up now so you can get back to your work. But I needed to ask you something first. This is about the message from Barbara. Okay, go ahead, Steve said calmly, willing to listen. Steve, what do you think about seeing a counselor? Someone who could help you talk things out with Barbara without pushing you too hard. How do you feel about that? No way, Steve replied immediately. It won't help, Lydia. Barb and I just don't see eye to eye on too many things, and it won't work. Would you think about it, Steve? Lydia prompted. They talked for a few more minutes, with Lydia gently urging him to consider counseling, but Steve remained firm in his refusal. Finally, Lydia stopped asking, but made him promise to call her now and then just to chat. Steve agreed. Steve hadn't seen his wife in 6 weeks, not since their argument on that Saturday afternoon. Now he wasn't looking forward to meeting her again, especially not in a counselor's office. The whole thing felt pointless. 3 days earlier, Steve had been called into the CFO's office. Willis Johnson, the chief financial officer, was the one who made the real decisions in the company. He'd been friends with the owner for over 60 years, and when Mr. Johnson spoke, everyone listened. The meeting was friendly enough, but there was a clear message. The company believed Steve's upcoming promotion to district supervisor was a good choice, but they felt someone in his position needed a supportive spouse. Mr. Johnson quickly brushed over why the company cared about Steve's personal life, but it was clear that attending counseling was almost a requirement for the new job. They seemed to hope Steve would reconcile with Barbara, though they didn't say it outright. Steve hadn't even realized upper management knew about his marital issues. The meeting left him feeling uneasy, and it seemed Mr. Johnson felt the same. So here he was, on a Thursday evening, in a place he didn't want to be. He would have much preferred watching college football. He sat across from Barbara in the small waiting room, responding to her attempts at conversation with shrugs or short answers. Then the door swung open and a short, round man in a shirt bustled in. He was older, with a red face and a ring of white hair around his bald head. Moving quickly toward his inner office, he called out, Sorry. Traffic was bad tonight. Come on in, let's get started. He opened the office door wide and hurried inside. Steve blinked, shrugged, and got up to follow him, still avoiding eye contact with Barbara. The man's name was Verna Houston. He wasn't a psychiatrist or psychologist, but had graduated from a certified counseling school in Austin and had been doing family counseling for 26 years. He kept up with the latest developments in his field, which was why he was late. He'd been at a class. Apologizing again for his tardiness, he quickly moved past the small talk to focus on why they were there. After a moment, he looked at them and asked, "What do you each want to achieve through counseling? Mrs. Curtis?" The question caught Barbara off guard. "Well, I want to reconcile with my husband so we can move forward in our lives," she stammered. "I see," Houston responded. "What do you mean by moving forward? What's the problem?" he asked thoughtfully. Barbara blushed and looked away, focusing on the curtain rod by the window. "Steve caught me in City View Park with a man I know," she finally admitted. "He thinks something inappropriate happened." "And why would your husband think that?" Houston asked. Barbara avoided eye contact, staring at anything but Houston or Steve. "Because we were just sitting in his car and... oh, I don't know." Her words trailed off, her hands lifting and then dropping back into her lap. Steve noticed Houston glancing at Barbara's hands, a slight frown forming on his face. It struck Steve that Houston was a sharp observer, perhaps understanding more than he let on. "Don't forget to mention the details you left out, okay, dear?" Steve interjected. Barbara shot him a quick look, but Houston intervened. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Curtis." His tone was brisk, emotionless. "Please go on, Mrs. Curtis." "I didn't mean to do anything wrong," Barbara said. "I was confused. I don't even know why I went with him that day, but I wouldn't have done anything bad. It was just a mistake." "A mistake?" Houston repeated, watching Barbara closely. "Yes, I'm sure I wouldn't have made any bad choices," she said, trying to sound firm. When she didn't say more, Houston turned to Steve. "What are your goals for family counseling, Mr. Curtis?" Steve was prepared for the question. "I have two goals, one short-term and one long-term," he said. "First, in the short term, I want my wife to tell her lawyer to stop making the divorce difficult. Second, I want to move on with my life. That's my long-term goal." "You don't seem to think your marriage to Barbara can get past this problem, do you?" Houston asked. "There is no hope," Steve replied bluntly. "Then why are you here?" the counselor probed. "Because my job is making me come," Steve answered plainly. Houston nodded. "Okay, as long as you don't come in here angry and yelling, we'll handle that," he said. "I won't promise anything," Steve responded coolly, making it clear he wasn't eager to cooperate. Houston's face remained neutral, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Barbara said she made a bad mistake," Houston continued. "What does that mean to you?" "Nope, I'm not playing that game," Steve retorted. "A mistake is dialing the wrong number. That's not what happened. She chose to get in that man's car and made choices that led to this situation." He forced himself to sit back in his chair. "And it wasn't the first time. She's not honest when telling the truth would be better for her. She lied to her parents about why I kicked her out, and I had to show them proof before the truth came out." "Is that how it happened when you met with your parents, Mrs. Curtis?" Houston asked, then added, "And your grandmother?" Barbara fidgeted in her chair, avoiding Houston's gaze. "Yeah, that's pretty much it," she mumbled. "I see," Houston said in a flat tone, looking between Steve and Barbara. Suddenly, he sat up straighter, resting his elbows on his desk. "Mr. Curtis, Mrs. Curtis, I see my role here as helping you both talk about your disagreement in a safe place where you can speak freely. I don't know you, and I won't have dinner with you. I won't call to chat on a Sunday," he said firmly, then gently added, "Let's make sure one person speaks at a time. Barbara, please go on." Barbara took a deep breath to collect her thoughts. "I realize now that I should have been more open with Steve about how I felt. I never meant to make him feel betrayed, but I understand why he would." Houston nodded. "Communication is very important. Steve, how do you feel about what Barbara just shared?" Steve crossed his arms, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "It's frustrating to find out there were things I didn't know. I just want to understand why things went this way." "That's a fair concern," Mr. Houston agreed. It's important to share your feelings, but also to listen. Both of you need to feel safe to express your thoughts without fear of judgment. Barbara looked at Steve, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. I want us to move forward. I don't want to stay stuck in the past. Agreed, Steve replied after a pause, but we need to work on rebuilding trust. Absolutely, Mr. Houston said. Trust takes time to rebuild. It might help to discuss how you both can take small steps in your daily lives to restore that trust. As they continued the conversation, it became clear that both Barbara and Steve were willing to try and work through their problems. They left the session feeling a glimmer of hope about healing their relationship. Houston raised his hand to pause the discussion. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've just talked about. It's crucial that both of you feel heard here. Barbara took a deep breath and turned to Steve. I do love you. Yes, I made a mistake, but that doesn't define our whole relationship. I want us to move past this together. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I feel like you're only seeing the worst parts without considering the whole picture. It's not fair to think of me as someone who would completely betray you. Mr. Houston nodded, encouraging her to continue. Steve, I understand your feelings, but this situation wasn't what it seemed. I want to rebuild trust and communicate better. I really hope we can work through this. Steve crossed his arms and looked away for a moment. I feel hurt. It's not just one thing. It's a pattern, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I want to feel safe and appreciated in this relationship. Mr. Houston intervened. It seems like both of you have unresolved feelings that need to be addressed if you want to move forward. Rebuilding trust is key. Barbara nodded, looking at Steve intently. I really want that, Steve. I want to show you that I care about our marriage. Steve looked at her, doubt still lingering in his eyes. I want that too, but we both have to try. We need to be open and honest to heal. Then let's discuss how we can communicate better, Mr. Houston suggested. What can you both do to ensure your needs are met? The conversation shifted toward finding ways to strengthen their bond and better understand each other. However, Steve's thoughts quickly turned to the past. Remember that guy, Brian, from when we were dating? Steve began, holding up his right index finger. I saw you with him just a week after we decided to be exclusive. I didn't think much of it, but then you broke a date with me to meet your old boyfriend, and that bothered me. We were apart for 6 months after that, Steve said, turning to the counselor. Then there was Jimmy. What's his last name? Last year before Christmas, Steve continued, raising his middle finger to join the first. I didn't see anything wrong, but you two were laughing and looking at each other while I was right there. I'm still hurt by how you disrespected me that night, and I'm not sure I'll ever get past it. You even defended him when we talked about it. You took his side. Steve raised his hand to stop Mr. Houston from interjecting. This isn't new to her, Mr. Houston, Steve said firmly. I don't often shout, but I will make my point. He added his ring finger to the others. Now for the third one, Rafe Porter. I have proof you were close with him. I saw clear signs of affection at least twice. That's 3 times I know you've betrayed me or our marriage. Barbara, this has become a habit for you. No more 3 strikes and you're out. Steve turned back to the counselor. Do you want to know the real problem? My wife promised to love, honor, and respect me when we got married. She promised to stay faithful, and she's broken all those promises. She lies, cheats, and puts others before me, and I won't put up with it anymore. I should never have taken her back after she hurt me in college. How foolish of me, Steve said bitterly. I loved her, and I thought she loved me. Leaning close to Barbara, his face just inches from hers, Steve added with a mocking tone, But don't worry, dear. I'm learning not to love you. It gets a bit easier each day. His voice was intense, and Barbara flinched at the strength of his words. I don't trust you, Steve continued. In my opinion, you're a liar, and I can't believe anything you say. When you claim you weren't with that person at the park, I think you're lying. Everything points to you being there. Steve continued, his voice steady but filled with frustration. I don't believe you when you say you weren't with him. I have a photo that shows you in a compromising situation at that gathering. Do you think I'm foolish, Barbara? People don't act that way unless there's more going on than what you're admitting. He leaned in, his tone growing more intense. You're not being honest. Don't tell me you just want to move on. What you really want is to sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened. But that's not going to work this time. Steve frowned. You said I'm making too much of this. You, your dad, your mom, and maybe even your grandma have all said I'm overreacting. I'm tired of that word. I'm not overreacting. I'm reacting to your lies, your betrayal, and your disrespect. That's just facing the truth. Taking a deep breath, Steve leaned back in his chair. Strangely, he felt a sense of relief. Talking about his problems with someone neutral seemed to help. Without her family constantly defending her, Barbara was finally hearing him out. That's all, Steve said calmly to the counselor. There was a long pause before Mr. Houston spoke. All right, I think we have a good understanding of where we are. It's a good time to stop for tonight. We'll have individual sessions next week and then meet together again next Thursday. I'd like both of you to reflect on what your partner has shared and think about how you can address these issues. Wait, Barbara protested, her voice rising. What about me? Don't I get a chance to talk? You've already had your chance, Mrs. Curtis, the counselor said gently. You discussed the main issue in your relationship, and Steve shared his thoughts too. Now the best thing you can do is work on addressing these problems for each other. There's no need to defend your views further. What's important is that you both recognize these issues, and we can work on resolving them before tackling anything else. Steve added bluntly, honestly, if you're not going to be real, then don't say anything at all. Barbara's eyes flared with annoyance, but she held back her retort. Mr. Houston remained calm. We need honesty to solve what's bothering both of you, right? Steve nodded firmly. Barbara, feeling cornered, reluctantly agreed, though she didn't like how it seemed Mr. Houston was siding with Steve. Later, at her grandmother Lydia's house, Barbara sat in a comfortable chair, recounting the recent events. Lydia, sitting on a nearby sofa, listened intently. What about the Christmas party? Lydia asked sharply. Barbara had been spending more time with her grandmother lately, feeling increasingly isolated as her parents began to support Steve more. Her father, who was supposed to be on her side, seemed to be siding with her husband, leaving her confused and alone. Even her mother was asking probing questions about her relationship with Rafe Porter. Well, Steve and I went to the Christmas party for my work, Barbara began. He thought I was paying too much attention to Jimmy Roberts. I wasn't, but Steve thought so. Then he got upset about a joke Jimmy told me and made a big scene. Can you believe that? Jimmy is Mr. Reynolds' nephew. He's important at the firm, and Steve was rude to him. Lydia thought about her granddaughter's story for a moment. What was the joke? She asked, frowning when Barbara explained. Finally, Lydia moved a large ottoman closer to Barbara's chair. So were you and this Jimmy close together? Lydia asked. Well, yes, Barbara admitted. But he's the boss's nephew, right? Lydia sniffed dismissively, but let it go. Were you two talking closely? How did he end up next to you anyway? Wasn't he with someone? I don't think he had a date or anything, Barbara replied, sounding uncertain. Jimmy sat by me when he came into the room. There wasn't anything strange about that. We've had lunch together a lot, and he always sits next to me. No one ever said anything about it. So, were you two talking closely? Lydia pressed. No, Barbara said quickly, then hesitated. Well, sometimes, but just talking, you know. Lydia sighed, moving even closer. So he was like this? She leaned toward Barbara, resting her arm close to hers. Well, yeah, but, Barbara began, sounding defensive. And he told you jokes that only the two of you laughed at? I guess, Barbara replied, her annoyance growing. You're making it seem like a big deal, but it really wasn't. Lydia leaned in closer, lowering her voice as she spoke. And sometimes Jimmy would talk softly, like he was only talking to you because you were special, didn't he? Her fingers brushed Barbara's arm, drawing her closer without thinking. When Barbara realized, she blushed and pulled away. Lydia chuckled, but it was a humorless laugh. If you had pulled back when Jimmy was being flirtatious, Steve wouldn't have gotten so mad, Lydia said pointedly. Barbara started to protest, but then paused, thinking. Lydia let the silence stretch. Oh no, Barbara finally admitted, realization dawning on her. He wasn't he? Definitely, Lydia replied, and he thought he could get away with it right in front of your husband, too. Where do you think he got that idea? Barbara didn't answer. Maybe it was because you had lunch with him all the time, Lydia suggested. Maybe it was because you laughed at his jokes, talked softly so only you could hear. Maybe you said things about Steve that made Jimmy think he was some kind of joke. And maybe, just maybe, you made Jimmy believe he was part of something with you that Steve wasn't. Barbara looked down, sadness in her eyes. No, Noni, she said quietly. I would never do anything wrong with Jimmy Roberts. I wouldn't ever. But you already did something wrong, Lydia interrupted. The first time you told Jimmy anything negative about Steve, you hurt your husband, and you did it again when you started meeting Jimmy for lunch or happy hour. Barbara quickly shook her head at the idea of having dinner with him. Thank goodness for small favors, Lydia remarked. But the first time you laughed when Jimmy insulted Steve's intelligence, you really hurt him, honey. It was just a joke, Barbara replied, nearly in tears. It got blown out of proportion. It wasn't just a joke, Lydia said firmly. Jimmy was trying to isolate you, keep you away from others, especially your husband, and you let him think he had a chance. Barbara was stunned by her grandmother's words. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't serious. Steve just misunderstood, and he didn't need to react the way he did. Lydia frowned. Barbara, when Jimmy said Steve wasn't smart enough to get that joke, why didn't you tell him that your husband was just hours away from earning his engineering degree? Why didn't you stand up for Steve instead of siding with Jimmy? Barbara looked down, feeling helpless and ashamed. She couldn't find any words to defend herself. Honey, you need to sort things out fast, Lydia said briskly, standing up and pushing the ottoman back in place. In my day, if I had done something like that, my husband would have confronted the man right away, and every man at the table would have supported him. Lydia added softly, I love you, but you need to get yourself together or you'll lose your man. I know Steve, and he won't tolerate what you're doing. Barbara looked up at her grandmother, stung by her harsh words. She had never heard her Noni speak to her like this before, and it left her speechless. This isn't helping, Steve said with frustration. We've been in counseling for 5 weeks, and we're just going in circles. He focused on Mr. Houston, trying to ignore Barbara as much as possible. But I told you, Barbara argued. I see now that I shouldn't have met with Chad, even if it was just to say goodbye. I realize it was wrong, but I can't change it now. And I was wrong to let Jimmy get so close, she added. I thought he was just being friendly when you weren't around. Steve watched her quietly. He heard her words, but they didn't resonate with him. He shook his head, feeling exhausted. I don't understand what you're saying, Steve said. When was I ever not nice to you? Barbara felt a surge of resentment. Well, you wanted to go to that guy's house for Thanksgiving, she said. You made me go, and I had already promised my parents we would be there. I had to call and tell them we were going somewhere else. No, I didn't, Steve replied quickly. Remember, we agreed we'd spent 3 Thanksgivings at your mom's. We thought it would be good to do something different. Barbara hesitated, memories resurfacing. Maybe you're right, she admitted reluctantly. But when we got there, it was a small, messy house and his quiet wife. The house was clean inside and out, Steve interrupted gently. It needed paint, but they couldn't afford it. That guy, Greg, saved my life 5 years ago when a heavy beam fell from 9 stories up. It would have crushed me. I owe him everything, and he won't accept anything in return. Barbara stared at Steve, realizing she had never known this. And his quiet wife has a name, Tanya, Steve continued. When they were teens in Texas, she defended Greg against a rabid dog for 15 minutes with just a stick until he could get up after hitting his head. They've been together since 6th grade. She couldn't do to Greg what you've done to me. Just thinking about it would break her. Steve straightened, his jaw tight. Barbara sighed, defeated. Okay, you're right. I remember we agreed to go to their house. It's just that when Jimmy started flirting with me, I felt like you were pulling away, not listening to me. Steve looked at her, surprised by this admission. And what about Raphael, the Thunderbird man? Porter? He asked with sarcasm. Barbara was ready for this. You left me alone for that long trip, she replied. I needed you, but you weren't there. Rafe was in the building handling some issues and saw me upset. I didn't expect things to get so messy. I just needed someone to talk to, and he was there. Steve looked into her eyes, searching for truth. I had to go on that trip, and we talked about it. It was the only one this year. How could you need me so much that you turned to another man so quickly? We were getting along better before that. How could you? It just happened, Barbara said after a pause. I didn't plan it. I didn't want it. It just happened. Steve turned away in frustration. I know when someone's making excuses, Barbara. You're supposed to be honest. That's what we agreed on. I had a miscarriage, Barbara suddenly shouted. Both men stared at her in shock. What? Steve asked, confused. While you were away, Barbara said flatly. 3 days after you left, I started bleeding and went to the hospital. I didn't know I was pregnant. Steve's mind spun. Barbara had lost a baby, and he hadn't even known. But how could you go to the hospital for something so serious and not tell anyone? How long were you there? A week, maybe more, Barbara replied softly. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mom or Dad. I only called them at night when it was quiet in the hospital. When I got home, I acted like I just needed time alone. I lost 20 pounds. You noticed when you got back. Why? Steve demanded. Why did you hide this from me? Why keep something so important from me? Barbara opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. Tears filled her eyes. Oh God, I lost my baby. I lost my baby. Steve instinctively turned toward her, almost standing to comfort her, but he hesitated, remembering all the excuses she'd made during their counseling sessions. He made himself stay seated. This didn't change anything. In the following session, Mr. Houston spoke gently. Last week, we talked about your miscarriage, Barbara. The session had ended abruptly when Barbara couldn't continue. Barbara nodded, seeming steadier than before. She faced Steve directly. Steve, I'm so sorry I hid this from you, she said softly. Mr. Houston and I discussed it in our individual sessions, but I still don't know why I did it. I felt ashamed, like it was my fault because I didn't even know I was pregnant. I can't explain why I couldn't share my pain with you. Someday when I understand it better, I'll tell you why. But right now, I just don't know. Steve looked at her, sensing she was finally telling the truth. He shrugged, feeling the weight of their shared pain but unsure of what to do next. Okay, you'll tell me, Steve said simply. Since you're being honest today, maybe you can share another secret. How many times did you see Raphael Porter? Barbara looked away. I never had any interactions with him like that, she replied. You're lying, Steve said bluntly, and you're not very good at hiding it. Turning to the counselor, he added, I'm done for tonight. Until my wife is ready to tell me the truth, there's no point in talking. Without another word, he stood up and walked out. 2 weeks later, Steve was back in the counselor's office, giving Barbara another chance. She had promised not to dodge his questions. How many times? Steve asked again. Barbara took a deep breath. Twice, she admitted quickly. But it wasn't what you think. Steve slumped in his chair, rolling his eyes in disbelief. Suddenly, he jumped up, pulling the blinds open and staring wildly out the window. I don't see it, Barb. Maybe it's not coming tonight. You think? He said sarcastically. Mr. Houston cleared his throat. What isn't coming tonight, Mr. Curtis? The mothership, of course, Steve replied with a smirk. My wife must have been taken by aliens who think differently than we do. Isn't that what she's saying? Her alien friends were supposed to pick her up, but without the big ship in sight, it looks like it won't be tonight after all. Steve sat back down, enjoying his joke. Mr. Houston remained serious, though Steve caught a brief smile before the counselor lowered the blinds. Barbara, red-faced, asked, Can I continue? Mr. Houston nodded. What I meant was Mr. Porter only wanted me to help him, Barbara said quietly, staring at the floor. I only helped him through his pants. I never really touched him. Steve watched her silently, disbelief evident on his face. If that's true, you must be the saddest cheater ever, he said. And Raphael must have no skills. All that sneaking around, all those lies, and that's all he got? That's really pathetic. Barbara's face burned with embarrassment. It's true, she yelled, but Steve shook his head, unconvinced. I'll come back when she's ready to be honest, he said, standing up. I have better things to do than waste time with a liar and a cheat. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Later, talking to her grandmother, Lydia asked, So you told Steve what really happened? Yeah, Barbara replied, upset. But he didn't believe me. He said it was pathetic. Lydia chuckled but quickly stopped herself. Well, sweetie, It's not the most exciting story I've heard, she said, noticing Barbara's discomfort. But you really need to accept this. Whatever you did with that man, you shouldn't have done it. You had no right to share anything like that with anyone but your husband. It wasn't like that, Barbara protested, feeling awkward discussing this with her grandmother. Lydia pressed on. Let me ask you this. If Steve was right there, she pointed to the couch, and this poor guy was in front of you, would you feel okay doing anything wrong in front of him? Barbara's cheeks flushed. Of course not, she said. Lydia nodded. Okay, would you let Rafe get too friendly with you? Would you have done any of that with your husband watching? Barbara's face turned pale. She closed her eyes and whispered, No. Lydia let the silence linger, allowing Barbara to absorb the weight of her actions. Her granddaughter was finally confronting something she had avoided for a long time. Do you see why Steve is upset about how you've been acting? Lydia asked gently. Barbie, if you can't do it in front of your husband, then it's wrong. Barbara's face twisted in pain. I guess I've known this all along, she admitted tiredly. But it sounds so horrible when you say it, Nani. It was awful, Lydia said firmly. It's the most shameful thing I've ever heard you do, Barbara. How could you let something like that happen? Didn't you think about how it would hurt Steve? Nani, it felt like it didn't involve Steve. I wasn't thinking about us, Barbara said, frustration clear on her face. I don't know how to explain it. When I was with Rafe, it felt like I was in another world and it didn't seem real. I see now it was wrong, but at the time I wasn't thinking about the consequences. Lydia nodded, letting the silence linger. Do you really want to know why? She finally asked. Barbara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Then you need to be open with Verna Houston. Don't try to cover anything up. Just tell him how you felt and answer all his questions sincerely. That's the only way you can get help. Understand? Barbara nodded again, and Lydia pulled her into a comforting embrace. It's going to be okay, Bobby. It will be okay. No matter what, you'll get through this. But Nani, I don't think Steve loves me anymore, Barbara cried. I don't know what to do. Barbara wept on her grandmother's shoulder for a long time. Lydia gently patted her back until she calmed down a bit. Do you love Steve? Lydia asked. Barbara nodded. Lydia sighed. You know, Steve doesn't feel the same way right now, she said softly. He doesn't see how you could love him after what's happened. I know, but I never stopped loving him, Barbara said with emotion. I made some mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt him. I thought he would never find out. I'm so confused, Nani. But you still love Steve and want to stay with him? Lydia asked, pressing on. Wait, don't answer right away. Think about it. Your husband doesn't love you right now, and he might not ever love you again. Are you ready to face that? Barbara took a moment to think. Nani, she said softly, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I made mistakes, but I know Steve is the best thing that ever happened to me. I want him to love me again, like he did before, and I'll do anything to make that happen. That's not going to be easy, Lydia said firmly. You're not the same person he married. He was in love with the woman you were then. He doesn't even know who you are now. You've changed your marriage in a way that's hurt it deeply. Steve is angry, and it might take a long time for that to change. Can you handle the cruel words and the rudeness until he gets it all out of his system? Can you... Barbara thought carefully about what her grandmother said. She understood the challenge. I want my husband back, she said strongly. I want him back so badly. I'll do anything to show him I'm still his woman and I won't make a fool of myself again. But what do I do now? She asked. If he doesn't love me anymore, what do I do? Lydia chuckled softly. Why, that's the simplest thing ever, dear. You make him fall in love with you again. In her next counseling session, Barbara was more determined. Total honesty, that's the key, Mr. Houston said firmly. If there's any chance of fixing things with Steve, he needs to see that you're open and honest. No hiding the truth, no softening the facts, no shame. I understand, Mr. Houston, Barbara replied quietly. I've been foolish, and I see that now. I thought things would go away if I just ignored my mistakes. I was ashamed of what I did, so I hid it. But my grandmother has talked to me a lot, and I now understand how silly and selfish I've been. I'm sorry for that. I'll apologize to Steve when I see him, Barbara said, her voice steady. The counselor leaned back, observing her carefully. After a moment, he sighed, seeing her sincerity. She was calm today, her eyes meeting his directly. Her hands rested still in her lap, a stark contrast to the nervous fidgeting of past sessions. "Okay, Barbara," he began. "I have to warn you. From now on, you might feel like I'm being tough on you, like I'm challenging you constantly. You may not like me much, but we can't avoid the hard truths anymore. No more soft words or dodging issues. Do you understand? It's time to face everything head on." Barbara nodded, her voice soft but determined. "I know I'm late, but I hope it's not too late." "We'll see," Mr. Houston replied, his tone even. "Let's get started. Barbara, what you've done has deeply hurt Steve. He feels like you've turned something good into something painful. He's struggling, feeling lost and betrayed. He thought marriage meant the end of competition for your affection, but now he feels like he's constantly competing. Worse, he doesn't know what he did wrong. He's been questioning himself, trying to figure out why you made these choices, but he can't find any clear answers. That's tearing him apart." The counselor paused, watching Barbara's face as the weight of his words sank in. "Mr. Houston," she said quietly, "would it help if I showed Steve that I only saw Rafe Porter twice? Would that give him something stable to hold on to?" "It might," he replied slowly. "But honestly, Barbara, I doubt he'll believe that." Barbara sighed, her frustration evident. "I just want to move forward. I feel stuck." The counselor nodded, understanding her desperation. "It's important to move forward, but we have to face these feelings first. Recognizing them is the first step toward healing." Steve, who had been silent, finally spoke, his voice heavy with weariness. "I get that, but it's hard when it feels like we're just going in circles. I don't want to stay stuck in the past." "Then let's think about what comes next," Mr. Houston suggested. "What are your goals, Steve, beyond this situation?" Steve thought for a moment, his expression softening as he considered. "I want to feel like myself again. I want to get back to the things that make me happy." "That's a good start," the counselor encouraged. "What are some things you've always enjoyed?" "I used to love hiking and traveling," Steve said, a hint of enthusiasm returning to his voice. "I haven't done either in a long time." "Great! Let's work on bringing those activities back into your life," Mr. Houston suggested, noting the slight smile on Steve's face. "Let's make a plan." Steve nodded, but then his expression darkened again. "Mr. Houston, I feel frustrated, sad, and sometimes overwhelmed. I've accepted that I might divorce my wife. I'm done arguing. I just want to move on." The counselor's face grew serious. "When trust is broken, there's a limited time to help both partners find their way back to each other. I'm worried that time might be running out for you and Barbara." Steve shrugged. "What's there to talk about?" he asked, his tone resigned. Mr. Houston sighed, sensing the deep hurt in Steve's words and fearing that the path to reconciliation might be slipping away. "I'm not the one being dishonest. I haven't lied to you or Barbara since this all started," Steve said firmly. "What if I could show you proof that Barbara was telling the truth?" Mr. Houston asked, watching Steve's reaction carefully. Steve looked interested but skeptical. "How?" he asked. "Barbara asked me on Monday to arrange a lie detector test. I work part-time with the Sheriff's Department, which also collaborates with the FBI. I pulled a few strings, and a friend of mine conducted the test this morning. The results showed no dishonesty when she was questioned about her story." Steve thought for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You could have fooled me," he said finally. "It's hard to believe what she said is true, but if that's what the machine says, I guess I can accept it. Still, if you think that changes anything, I don't see how." Mr. Houston nodded slowly. "It's a start, Steve. But I understand this doesn't erase the hurt." Steve's lips tightened. "It would have been better if she'd told me the truth from the start, not just after everything fell apart." "I agree," Mr. Houston said, "but the fact that she's telling the truth now is something we can build on." Steve shrugged. "Maybe, but this is the third time I've had to forgive her. I got past the first two, but I was a fool to do that. I won't make that mistake again." "Steve, I understand how deeply you've been hurt," Mr. Houston said carefully. "But you and Barbara have many years of good times together. Do you really want to throw that all away without seeing if there's a way to repair the damage?" Steve frowned, feeling a mix of emotions. "So, you're trying to get me to overlook my feelings?" "No," Mr. Houston replied. "I'm asking you to acknowledge them fully. but I also want you to consider if there's any part of you that still wants to salvage this marriage." Steve paused, thinking it over. "I've gotten used to coming here for individual sessions and listening to Barbara every Thursday. I'll keep it up for a while, but there will come a day when it won't seem worth it anymore." "I understand," Mr. Houston said, "but if you're willing to keep coming, there's still hope. Just know that when you're here, I'll ask you to engage fully. If you're not willing to do that, then maybe it's time to reconsider." Steve nodded. "I get it." During their couples session on Thursday, Barbara faced Steve directly. "Steve, I want to say I'm sorry. I've hurt you, lied to you, and I haven't been honest for a long time. I know you can't accept my apology right now, and I know I've pushed you away too much. I kept saying, 'Let's move on,' without understanding the damage I caused. I'm sorry for that too. It took this big mess for me to realize I can't be selfish anymore." The session had been going on for nearly 30 minutes. Steve had asked Barbara a lot of questions, and he was surprised by how honestly she answered them. When she couldn't remember certain details, she admitted it instead of trying to cover it up. She even acknowledged that she hadn't kept notes, and that some moments hadn't seemed significant enough at the time to recall later. Steve accepted that, but asked her to try to remember and let him know if anything came back to her. For the first time, Barbara talked about the day Steve caught her with Porter. She explained that she had been feeling rebellious and made choices she regretted. While she hadn't planned to do anything wrong, she admitted that she might have crossed a line if Steve hadn't shown up. She confessed that she had felt a thrill in taking risks, even though she knew they were wrong. Seeing Steve walk in had been a shocking wake-up call, forcing her to confront the reality of what she had done and what it meant for their marriage. "How do you fix a broken egg?" she asked softly, as if the weight of her actions had finally settled on her shoulders. Steve added that Barbara admitted she didn't know how to fix the past, only that she could try not to make the same mistakes again. Her honesty silenced Steve for a moment. She explained how lost and lonely she had felt after the miscarriage, how she had no one to talk to, and how she had drifted into her involvement with Porter. She promised to figure out why she allowed herself to get so close to another man, why she justified her actions, and why she had changed her values. She would share whatever she learned, whether or not they stayed together. Steve interrupted. "I wouldn't listen to you? Didn't I tell you how much I cared about you?" Barbara took a deep breath. "It's silly, Steve. I know you cared, but I felt like you were just saying nice things because you were my husband. I didn't think it through." "That doesn't make sense," Steve replied sharply. "I know it doesn't," Barbara said calmly. "But at that time, I didn't question it. I just believed it." "So you messed up because someone said nice things to you? That's hard to understand." "No, Steve," Mr. Houston interjected. 30 to 40% of people in situations like this act out due to self-esteem issues." Steve glared at Mr. Houston, accepting his expertise but struggling to grasp this as a reason for Barbara's betrayal. He needed something tangible, something he could understand and fix. This explanation felt too vague. "Steve," Barbara said in a voice heavy with regret, "I don't know how to say how sorry I am. I know I've hurt you deeply. What I did was wrong and I'm so ashamed. I want to make it better, but—" "No," Steve cut her off. "You have no idea what I'm feeling. You can't." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "Before I met you, I lived next to a young woman named Debbie. She went through something terrible one night after work. I was there for her because I'd broken my ankle and we spent a lot of time together. She talked about how she felt like she'd lost a part of herself, something that made her strong and confident. I told her I understood, but I really didn't. I didn't grasp what she was going through. Now I think I understand a bit more. Barbara, what I'm feeling might be similar to what Debbie went through, but maybe not. Our situations are different, but her words make more sense to me now. I feel like a part of me has been taken away, something deep inside that I can't get back. I don't know if I'll ever feel whole again. There's a heavy ache in my stomach and a coldness in my chest that won't go away. It hurts so much, but it's the only thing I feel. If I let it go, I'd feel empty." Steve stood and walked slowly to the door. He turned back to Barbara and Mr. Houston. "You don't know how I feel, Barbara, but maybe one day you will. Someday someone might hurt you the way I've been hurt. Then you'll understand." He turned away and walked out, feeling much older than he really was. Steve had started to really dislike the words couples counseling. It felt like all he did was sit and listen while Barbara and Mr. Houston talked about her new feelings and how they connected to her past. Barbara had begun seeing a therapist, trying to make sense of everything, but to Steve, it seemed like they were just going in circles. Barbara had started seeing a therapist to understand her feelings of insecurity and low self-esteem, especially after her miscarriage. To Steve's surprise, she seemed almost happy about this self-discovery. Outside of Mr. Houston's office, she listened intently to Steve, joined in conversations, and even smiled more than she had in a long time. But for Steve, it felt like this newfound awareness was coming too late. Interrupting one of Barbara's discussions about her self-image, Steve said, "I have a few things to say, and then you can keep talking. I'll step aside so I won't get in the way. But here's the thing. I've been listening, and I'm confused. Barbara, you talk like you're the victim here, but I don't see it that way. Did you really feel this insecure before? Because it didn't seem that way to me. Your choices have changed our marriage, but now you come in here every week looking almost happy, like you're eager to learn more about yourself. Meanwhile, I'm struggling to find peace. I haven't slept well in months, but you seem to wake up eager for this journey of self-discovery. It feels unfair. You made the choices, but I'm the one who's suffering." The conversation shifted to what Steve needed emotionally, what Barbara had failed to provide before, and how her choices had impacted him. Steve sighed, frustrated by the endless talking. Mr. Houston brought out the forms they had filled out at the start of counseling. "In many ways, you two match well in your emotional needs," he said. "Steve, you listed affection as your top need, which is unusual since most men prioritize intimacy." Steve let out a loud sigh. "You guessed wrong," he replied bitterly. "Poor Rafe and I have one thing in common. Neither of us is getting any love from my lovely wife. I haven't felt close to her since March, and it wasn't great before that." Mr. Houston asked when Steve first noticed their connection starting to feel wrong. Before Barbara could answer, Steve said, "Since a couple of months after our honeymoon?" Barbara gasped in disbelief. "What?" she asked, clearly upset. This disagreement led to another half-hour of talking, but in the end, Steve just went quiet, frustrated. When Mr. Houston called for a break, Steve walked out without a word to Barbara or the counselor. His phone rang as he got into his truck, but he ignored it. Anger and sadness had become a constant in Steve's life. To sleep, he took a pill. To wake up, he drank coffee, a lot of it. His doctor had prescribed something for his sadness, but it made him feel anxious, so he stopped taking it. Two things bothered him most about Barbara's behavior. First, she kept equating her hurt from leaving home and facing her choices with the deep pain of her betrayal. Second, everyone around him seemed to think he was overreacting, which only added to his frustration. The weekend had been tough. Steve went to a sports bar with his brother John to watch the UT game, but even though the Longhorns won, it was a messy victory that left Steve feeling empty. Sunday dinner at John's house was pleasant enough, except for the clear bond between John and his wife, Sandy. When Sandy rubbed John's neck, Steve had to look away, unable to hide his feelings. He made excuses to leave early. Now, as he watched the Monday night football game between the Cowboys and Seattle, the Cowboys were barely holding on to a 2-point lead, and Steve found it hard to care. The game, like everything else lately, just wasn't holding his attention. Steve found himself stuck in his own pain, fixating on how Barbara claimed to understand his feelings, but never truly grasped the depth of his hurt. He knew he had blown things out of proportion in his head and struggled to figure out how to show Barbara that her problems paled in comparison to what she had put him through. This frustration kept him awake at night and distracted during the day. As he half-watched the Cowboys fumble through another play, an unexpected visitor appeared. "Hi, baby," Kimberly said with a bright smile. "Are you happy to see me?" Caught off guard, Steve stammered, "Sure, Kimberly, how are you?" His young sister-in-law, now 18, had always been full of energy, but something about her seemed different. She had grown into a young woman, and the way she looked at him stirred feelings he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. "Are you going to let me in?" she asked playfully. Flustered, Steve opened the door and hung up her raincoat. Kimberly walked into the living room, looking out at the rain, then turned and smiled at him in a way that made him take a step back. She moved closer, pulling his head down to meet her gaze, but then quickly let go and sat down on the couch. "When will you be divorced from my sister?" she asked bluntly. Steve hesitated before answering. "It looks like it will be a few more months. Barbara's lawyer just filed for another delay." He felt uneasy discussing this with her and troubled by how casually she spoke about her sister. Kimberly smiled. "Don't you remember?" she asked softly. "At the barbecue when I said I would make you like me more than her?" Steve did remember. Kimberly had been just 12 at the time, full of energy and constantly by his side, much to Barbara's annoyance. Now she was a confident young woman, and Steve felt a mix of emotions stirring within him. Barbara was tall and slim, while Kimberly was shorter and fuller, with a healthy, strong look that caught his attention in ways he hadn't expected. "I remember," Steve finally said, trying to lighten the mood. "You were that lively 12-year-old who loved to annoy the adults and catch the boys' attention." Kimberly playfully stuck her tongue out, and Steve laughed, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. As they chatted about random things, recalling memories from her parents' house, Steve felt a rare sense of happiness. At one point, Kimberly took his hand and he didn't pull away, savoring the moment. It had been too long since he felt anything close to happiness. When the football game ended, Steve knew it was time to end the evening. Kimberly was still young, just out of high school, and he was 27, in the middle of a painful divorce with her sister. Though Kimberly seemed hesitant to leave, Steve gently led her to the door, making her promise to call when she got home, worried about her driving in the heavy rain. When she called, he kept the conversation short, though he knew she would have talked for hours. That night, Steve slept well for the first time in a long while and woke up with a renewed appetite, a small sign of life returning. "I'm doing just fine, Elaine," Steve replied. "And you?" "I'm good, thanks," she said with a warm smile, settling into the chair across from him. Elaine, a tall, slim woman with blonde hair, had become a regular presence in Steve's life. They often met to share updates about their respective marriages. Though Steve had stopped worrying about Rafe and Barbara, Elaine remained anxious, trying to fix her marriage for the sake of their young daughter. Steve was surprised at how close they had become, though they both kept things strictly friendly, aware of what was at stake. "How are things with your husband?" Steve asked cautiously. "Pretty well," Elaine said, scanning the menu. "It's been about 2 months since he last tried to contact Barbara, and she hasn't reached out to him either." "Are you sure?" Steve asked, a hint of doubt in his voice. "Pretty sure," Elaine replied confidently. "I check his emails and he shows me his phone every night. I even go through the online phone bill in the mailbox, nothing suspicious. I also got the IT guy at his work to agree to show me all his emails. Amazing what a $100 bill in an unmarked envelope can do, right?" Steve laughed. "You're thorough, aren't you?" "Absolutely," Elaine said firmly. "I don't trust him at all, and he knows if I ever lose track of where he is or who he's with, I'll serve him papers. I've got him scared I might leave, and for now, that's fine with me." Steve smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Elaine's words reminded him that her marriage might survive, but his was beyond saving. "How are things with you?" Elaine asked as she placed her order. "Nothing's changed," Steve admitted. "Barb's lawyer keeps dragging things out, asking for more details and pushing for meetings. It's frustrating, but there's not much I can do. I think my lawyer's making a fortune off me," he added with a bitter smile. Elaine laughed softly. "Yeah, I get that." "And counseling's not going great," Steve continued, his tone sharp. "Barb finally admitted to the affair, but now she's seeing a therapist, and I think they're just filling her head with nonsense. There's still no explanation for why she keeps doing this." Elaine reached out and touched his hand. "I know, Steve. I wish all of this had never happened." "That's life," Steve said with a shrug. They sat in silence for a moment, waiting for their meals. "Something strange happened Monday night," Steve said after the waitress cleared their salad plates. "Oh? What was it?" Elaine asked, intrigued. "My sister-in-law came over," Steve said carefully. "Made herself right at home." Elaine giggled. "Sounds like she wants your attention." "I'm not sure what she's up to," Steve admitted. "She liked me when she was younger, but I thought she was over it." "How old is she now?" Elaine asked. "Almost 19, Steve replied hesitantly. "Her birthday's right after Thanksgiving." Well, she's old enough now, Elaine said, nodding, and it sounds like she hasn't forgotten about you. They chatted for a while longer until their meals arrived. I think I should be a bit jealous, Elaine said playfully, waving her fork. Excuse me? Steve asked, surprised. Well, if you're going to have a relationship with Barbara's sister, don't you have to keep me in mind? Elaine teased. Steve laughed, but then her expression grew more serious. I guess that shows me where your head is, she said softly. Realizing what she meant, Steve quickly assured her, Oh no, I'm not going to do anything with her. Sure, Elaine said with a smirk, but you're a healthy, normal man. She's young, she likes you, and you haven't dated anyone in a while. Steve looked at her, unsure how to respond. So what will you do the next time she shows up at your door? Elaine asked. Steve hesitated. He wanted to say he was still married and wouldn't think about dating anyone else, but even he knew that wasn't true. His marriage had ended the moment he saw Barbara with Elaine's husband. Though they hadn't finalized the divorce, it didn't really matter. Elaine was trying to rebuild her marriage, but Steve felt that his vows had been irreparably broken. As he left the restaurant, he felt a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Elaine hadn't discouraged his interest in Barbara's sister, Kimberly. In fact, she seemed to imply that being with Kimberly would give Barbara a taste of her own medicine. After Kim's visit earlier that week, Steve had felt restless, a feeling he hadn't experienced since catching Barbara with another man. On Friday evening, without much thought, he bought a few new videos. He realized later that he was subconsciously seeking something. Just minutes after he got home, the doorbell rang. Steve barely had time to change into old jeans and a worn sweatshirt before opening the door. Hey, honey, Kimberly greeted with a smile. You don't need to cover up just for me. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Steve adjusted his sweatshirt. Hi, Kimberly, what's up? I'm looking for a strong man to hang out with, she said playfully. Well, I guess I could find some guys for you, Steve replied, feeling nervous. Kim laughed, noticing his discomfort. She walked past him into the kitchen. I'm hungry. What are you going to feed me? Steve, still distracted, suggested steak, baked potatoes, and broccoli. They talked casually as he cooked, avoiding any mention of Barbara. Later, as they ate, they kept the conversation light. Suddenly, Kimberly cheered from the living room. Steve felt a pang of worry, remembering the bag of videos he'd left out. He quickly walked over to find her smiling. I just found these videos you left here, she said with a grin. Relieved, Steve downplayed it. Oh, those are just old movies. Kim shrugged and put the videos aside. Why don't you come sit with me on the couch? She suggested playfully. Steve joined her and they spent the evening watching movies, laughing together. As the night went on, Steve realized Kimberly was no longer the little girl he had known. She was grown up now, and though the thought crossed his mind, he chose to focus on their time together as family. But then, Kimberly stood up suddenly and sat on his lap harder than she intended. The keys in his pocket pinched them both, disrupting the moment. Kim adjusted her skirt and Steve fought the urge to touch her. Can you make it better? She asked softly. Steve hesitated. No, Kim, I can't. She stared at him, anger flickering in her eyes. Not used to being denied, she looked away. Okay, honey, she finally said. They shared a quick, awkward kiss before she suggested watching another movie together the next night. Half an hour after she left, Steve sat alone, feeling empty and sad. Steve took a long shower, hoping it would help him relax. He started with cold water, then switched to warm as he let his thoughts flow. By the end, he cleaned himself thoroughly and finished with a cold rinse to refresh. Saturday mornings had become slow and uneventful for Steve. Without Barbara around, there were no chores to do, and he found little interest in the college football games on TV. He left one on in the background as he ate a simple lunch and mulled over the events of the previous night. He still couldn't understand why he had turned down Kimberly's offer. With his marriage to Barbara effectively over, why not? As he pondered his increasingly complicated life, the phone rang. Expecting it to be Kimberly or his parents, he answered, surprised to hear Barbara's voice instead. Hello, Barbara, he said flatly. What do you need? Barbara wanted to reschedule their counseling session, but Steve couldn't accommodate. His work commitments were unchangeable. Barbara sighed, sounding calm but disappointed. Steve, have you thought more about— No, Steve interrupted. I haven't. Barbara paused, then continued, "Steve, I know Mr. Houston explained things well to me, so I understand what you're feeling." Steve's frustration bubbled up. "No, Barbara, you don't know what I'm feeling. Stop saying that. It's not true, and it never will be." Barbara quickly backed off, ending the call with a soft goodbye. After hanging up, Steve's anger simmered, only to be replaced by a deep sadness. Just as he was sinking into it, Kimberly arrived, brightening the room with her energy. She jumped into his arms, her playful greeting pushing away the gloom that had settled over him. Over dinner, Kimberly chatted about her day and revealed she hadn't told her parents she was visiting. She brought movies, excited to share one with Steve. Though not particularly interested, Steve agreed. As the movie started, he quickly realized it wasn't to his taste. The loud music and chaotic scenes made him uneasy. When the camera panned to a group by the pool, Steve's attention was caught by one of the figures on screen. "Wow," he whispered. The girl looked strikingly like Kimberly, and the resemblance unsettled him. Kimberly's excitement filled the room as Steve grew increasingly uncomfortable watching the video. The girl on screen, though resembling Kimberly, unsettled him. He struggled to make sense of what he was seeing while Kimberly seemed engrossed, unaware of his rising unease. The sadness from earlier returned, deepening his confusion and sense of entrapment. The chaos of his thoughts and emotions felt overwhelming. Kimberly, noticing his distraction, suddenly stood and led him to the couch. She turned the TV back on and resumed watching, leaving Steve to wrestle with his turbulent feelings. As the night wore on, exhaustion overcame them. They fell asleep on the carpet, and Steve eventually fetched blankets to keep them warm. The next morning, Steve stood at the doorway of his in-laws' house, facing his father-in-law, Lloyd Montgomery. Despite Lloyd's usual vitality, Steve knew today would be a challenge. Lloyd greeted him warmly, and Diane, surprisingly affectionate, kissed Steve on the cheek. This late affection struck Steve as bittersweet. "This isn't just about Barbara," he began cautiously. "It's mostly about Kim." Lloyd and Diane exchanged worried glances. "Can we sit?" Steve asked. Diane guided him to a chair while she and Lloyd settled on the sofa. Steve took a deep breath, dreading what he was about to say. "Kim has gotten into some serious trouble," he said, pausing for effect. "It's worse than you think." Lloyd and Diane were taken aback. "We know she's had issues," Lloyd said cautiously. Steve shook his head. "It's more than that. We need to be careful." Frustrated but resolute, Steve retrieved a video cassette from his briefcase and inserted it into the VCR. He turned on the TV and took his seat, ready to reveal the truth. Steve pressed play on the video, and as the loud sounds filled the room, Lloyd and Diane's expressions shifted from confusion to shock. The gravity of the situation was evident as they realized something serious was unfolding. "I needed you to see this," Steve said firmly, pausing the video. Lloyd and Diane sat in stunned silence, trying to process the disturbing images. Steve knelt, feeling the weight of the moment, and watched Diane begin to cry. He turned off the TV and VCR, the room heavy with Diane's sobs. "Am I overreacting?" Steve asked calmly, though his frustration was clear. Lloyd's face, marked by deep sadness, showed he was struggling to respond. Steve closed his eyes, regretting how things had turned out and feeling a pang of sympathy for the devastated couple. "Lloyd, Diane," Steve said softly. The couple, now embracing, were trying to comfort each other. "I'm sorry, you needed to see this. Kimberly is in serious trouble." Lloyd, his voice rough, admitted, "You were right. I didn't realize how bad it was." Steve laid out 9 more videos beside the couch. "These are the only ones I know of. They're hard to watch, but you need to see them." The couple, too overwhelmed to respond, stared at the videos in silence. Steve shook his head and headed for the door. "Please get help for her," he said over his shoulder as he left. On the porch, Lloyd, looking older and distressed, caught up with Steve. "I wish you hadn't found those videos, but thank you for showing us. We couldn't help her until we knew." Steve avoided Lloyd's gaze. "Don't thank me. Kimberly left these at my house. She's been with me the past 2 weekends, not in Austin." Lloyd's fear was palpable as Steve drove away without looking back. At couples counseling, Steve felt oddly calm despite his guilt about the Montgomerys. He had discovered troubling evidence of Kimberly's drug use and had destroyed a kit he found hidden behind his toilet. He hoped Lloyd and Diane could help her in time. Verna Houston, sensing Steve's unusual calm, felt a twinge of unease. Despite his recent confrontational behavior, Steve now seemed peaceful and was tidying up his affairs. Verna, experienced but not a psychologist, recognized this as a potential warning sign. Verna licked his dry lips. His curiosity piqued as he watched Steve settle into his usual chair before Mr. Houston's desk. Steve, looking around the room, felt this might be his last visit. Mr. Houston broke the silence, noting Barbara's absence. "Did she say anything about being late?" Steve shrugged. "Haven't spoken to her in a while. I don't expect her to show. I think she's accepted the marriage is over." He leaned back, a small smile on his face, feeling oddly content. The sound of a door slamming and voices from the outer office interrupted him. Barbara walked in, late and flustered. "Sorry I'm late. My cab was delayed," she said, taking her seat. Steve was taken aback. "What happened to your car?" "Nothing," Barbara replied. "I just thought a cab was better tonight." Steve was confused. Barbara should have been upset and distant, not calmly attending this session. "What are you doing here? Why aren't you with my parents and sister?" Barbara met his gaze calmly. "I belong with my husband. For better or worse, remember?" Steve was taken aback. Barbara's demeanor was unexpectedly calm. "None of the things you said that day seemed to matter to you," he mumbled, his heart not in it. Barbara nodded. "I made mistakes, but we can work things out and get back to being husband and wife, right?" Steve was at a loss for words. He had expected Barbara to be angrier, not seeking reconciliation. Her hurt was evident, though she tried to hide it. Mr. Houston's polite reminder broke the tension. "May I ask—" "Oh, didn't Steve tell you?" Barbara interrupted. "He's been with my little sister the last few weekends." Steve flinched at Barbara's bluntness. Mr. Houston's concern was palpable. "How old is your sister?" he asked. "She turns 19 next Friday," Barbara replied, emphasizing the age. Mr. Houston, struggling to mask his anger, addressed Steve. "This is not helpful. We discussed avoiding revenge. I don't understand this." Steve defended himself softly. "She wanted to be with me. I didn't pursue her." "That doesn't make it right," Mr. Houston countered. "You're an adult. You know better," Barbara cut in. "Kimberly has substance use issues and has been with many people over the past 4 years. And Steve is correct. Kimberly has had feelings for him since she was 14. Mr. Houston, stunned, stared at Barbara in shock. Steve looked at Barbara, surprised to hear about Kimberly's feelings. Barbara's face softened. "Is she getting help?" Steve asked cautiously. Barbara nodded. "Yes, she's at a treatment center in Dallas, getting counseling to deal with her issues." Steve felt a slight relief. Her presence in the session didn't seem as troubling now. Verna Houston, grappling with the unexpected turn of events, decided it was time to address the issue. "Remember when we started this counseling? We agreed this was a safe space for you both. Mrs. Curtis, what do you want to tell your husband about this past week?" Barbara took a deep breath. "How could you do this to me?" she asked, her voice shaking. Steve didn't deny the impact of his actions. "You never listened to my pain," he explained. "You kept saying you understood, but you didn't. You and your family always told me I was overreacting." Barbara's eyes welled up. "You didn't have to involve her. You could have just shown my dad the videos," Steve agreed. "You're right, but I needed you to understand the depth of this hurt. I lost trust in you. Kimberly lost her innocence. Our marriage is shattered." Barbara was taken aback by his harsh words. She hadn't expected Steve to be so bitter. Steve continued, "What happened with Kimberly wasn't just about escaping my pain. It was a reflection of how deeply we're all hurting." Barbara looked down, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I only saw bits of it," she admitted. "You saw enough," Steve said gently. "You noticed how things spiraled out of control." Barbara nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Do you think I wasn't hurt? I've struggled with all of this," she said quietly. Steve sighed. "This has scarred all of us. Kimberly made reckless choices, and now we're all suffering. I regret everything. I was so lost in my sadness that I couldn't see a way out." He stood up, signaling he was finished. Turning to Mr. Houston, he added, "I told you I was having tough thoughts. I'm not sure if I've hurt myself with bad choices, but when Kim was with me, I didn't care. Steve looked at Barbara. "It's too late now, but I'm sorry." He walked slowly to the door, leaving the room in silence. Steve closed the door gently and walked to the parking lot, surprised when Barbara followed him. She looked determined and slightly upset as she caught up to him. "Are you done feeling sorry for yourself?" Barbara asked firmly. Steve was taken aback but took a deep breath and forced a small smile. "Yeah, I think I am," he replied quietly. He had come to terms with his actions but still felt unsettled. Barbara, clearly distressed by Steve's earlier revelations, suggested they get coffee at the Denny's across the street. Steve agreed, feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. They settled into a booth, and Barbara suddenly said, "I want to come home." Steve was surprised. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said. "Nothing's changed." "Oh, really?" Barbara retorted. "You've been with my sister. What I did with Mr. Raphael looks small compared to that. We need to think this through." As they sipped their coffee, Steve said, "What I did doesn't excuse your actions. When I was with your sister, you had already broken our vows. To me, our marriage ended when you chose to be alone in that situation." Barbara leaned in, her voice earnest. "I've apologized so many times. I know I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. I want to fix things and be the partner you need. Isn't that worth something?" Steve hesitated, feeling conflicted. "I'm not sure about much anymore, except that the thought of you with someone else makes me sick. It's not just the affair, it's everything we lost." Barbara's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I loved our time together and miss it so much, but you've pulled away. It's been hard to find those moments of joy with you." She took a tissue from her purse and dabbed her eyes. "I don't care about what's equal. I just want us to have those good times back. Please, give me a chance." Steve, feeling overwhelmed, burned his tongue on his coffee. He quickly cleaned up the spill, unsure of what to do next. Barbara watched him, waiting. "What do you have to lose?" she asked softly. Steve sighed, grappling with the whirlwind of emotions. He had once considered ending things, but now he was unsure of his next step. Barbara had asked Steve to forget everything from the past week and let her come back. His mind told him she had a point, but his instincts whispered she was just playing him. Feeling lost, he decided he had nothing to lose. "Okay," Steve said slowly. Barbara exhaled in relief, smiling nervously. "I'm hungry," she said, and they went for a late dinner. Despite the turmoil, they enjoyed their conversation, keeping it light. As they left the restaurant, Steve offered to call a cab. Barbara reminded him, "I said I wanted to come home." Steve felt outmaneuvered but agreed. When they reached his truck, Barbara pointed to the passenger seat where 2 large suitcases were waiting. "You're pretty confident," Steve grumbled as he loaded the bags. Barbara mentioned needing a new house key, which Steve had forgotten. He helped Barbara into the truck and she teased, "Nani said you wouldn't be unreasonable forever. She has a lot of faith in you." Steve grumbled about Nani's tricks as they drove away. Lydia and her assistant Phil, who had waited for hours, saw them leave together. "We can go now," Lydia told Phil. "Remember, you get time and a half for working late." Phil smiled, knowing he'd get double pay even if Lydia had joked otherwise. When they arrived home, Steve carried Barbara's bags inside. She checked the clean bedroom and made sure everything was in order. Steve stood in the doorway as Barbara inspected the bed. "If you want to sleep on the couch, I can make it into a bed," Steve offered. Barbara, hands on her hips, replied, "I'm sleeping in my bed tonight. Is that okay with you?" Barbara asked firmly. "Didn't he tell you to say that too?" "Nope," Barbara replied proudly. "That was all me." Steve smiled slightly. "Okay, it's your choice, but we're not going to—" Barbara interrupted. "You can bet on that." Steve nodded. "Looks like we agree on something." He stepped outside to the kitchen to grab a Coke, needing something to do while Barbara unpacked. The dry throat and sense of disarray from the past week had left him feeling disoriented. He was surprised when Barbara showed up, just as he thought the marriage was over. Her brief anger, followed by calm resolution, had confused him. He'd thought revealing Kimberly's issues would end things, but Barbara's sudden change of heart threw him. Now that Barbara was back, Steve had expected things to be cold, as they had been before. Instead, Barbara was warm and attentive, cooking his favorite meals and calling to check in. Despite his efforts to maintain distance, he found himself drawn to her kindness. She respected his space but tested boundaries, which he didn't entirely resist. In counseling, Verna Houston noted their progress and spoke about forgiveness. "Let's talk about what forgiveness means," Verna began, noticing Steve's tense reaction. Barbara said, "To me, it means recognizing when someone's done wrong, but understanding they want to change and won't repeat the mistake." Steve, unsure, responded, "I get that part, but how do you know if they really won't do it again?" Verna asked, "Does that make sense to you, Steve?" Steve, still confused, glanced at his wife and then at Verna. "Is it okay if I talk about us instead?" Barbara and Verna both spoke in unison. "Thanks," Steve replied flatly, then paused. "I'm not sure how I can ever trust Barbara again," Verna asked. "Do you think trust is necessary for forgiveness, Steve?" "I think so," Steve said slowly, looking uncertain. "But I'm open to other ideas." Barbara added, "To me, trust and forgiveness are different. Steve might forgive me and see that I'm genuinely sorry, but trust might take longer, if ever." Steve looked troubled. "I just want the woman I married back." There was a moment of silence. Verna nodded. "Exactly. Building trust takes time and requires openness and honesty from both of you. It's about understanding the past and working together to move forward." Barbara leaned in. "I want to be someone you can trust, Steve. I'm committed to showing you that I've changed and that we can be stronger." Steve nodded. "I appreciate that, but it will take more than words. I need to see actions that match." Mr. Houston agreed. "Actions speak louder than words. Trust is built over time through consistent behavior." Barbara replied, "I understand. I'm ready to be patient and show how much I care." Steve watched her, feeling a mix of hope and doubt. "I want to believe that, but it will take time for me to feel that way again." "That's fair," Barbara said gently. "Let's take it one step at a time." Verna smiled. "That's the way to go. Together you can face this challenge and emerge stronger." The next day, Lydia asked Barbara, "What did Steve say about love?" Barbara looked puzzled. "He didn't say much," Lydia said. "Steve didn't dismiss the idea. If he had, he would have said something. It's a good sign." Barbara was unsure. "What should I do next?" Lydia encouraged her. "You've overcome a big hurdle by moving back in. Now try a bit harder. With time, he'll fall in love with you again." Later, Barbara called Steve. "If you're free tonight, how about dinner at Ramon's?" Steve, smiling, asked, "Is this a date?" "You bet," Barbara replied cheerfully. "Sounds good. Do I drive or will you pick me up?" "You drive," Barbara laughed. "I've been craving one of their big margaritas." Steve laughed too. "I'll be home around 6. "Great," Barbara said, excited. "I'll make the reservations for 7:30, Barbara said, her heart lifting with happiness. "See you later, Barb," Steve replied. "Talk to you soon." "Bye, dear," Barbara said, feeling a mix of hope and uncertainty. Though Steve hadn't said he loved her, he hadn't objected to her calling him dear. It was a small but encouraging sign. Tonight was a step toward rekindling their love, and Barbara was determined to make it work. Late January had brought a string of illnesses for Steve. A flu left him bedridden for days, followed by a stomach bug. Despite working through it, he was exhausted and having trouble sleeping. Barbara grew increasingly worried, especially as things between them had been improving. Steve came home to an empty house. Barbara was visiting her grandmother and wouldn't return until late. He'd turned down her offer to call him from her grandmother's phone, not wanting to seem overbearing. After a few drinks with his brother John, Steve was tired and hungry. He ate quickly and was caught off guard when the phone rang. He choked on a chip while answering. "Hello?" he wheezed. "Honey, are you okay?" Barbara asked, her concern clear. Steve coughed and replied weakly, "Just choked on a chip. I'm fine." They talked briefly before Barbara handed the phone to Lydia, ensuring Steve knew she was safe. When Barbara got home, Steve was asleep, worn out from the drinks. She joined him in bed, worried about his weight loss and rough breathing. Despite his reassurances, she felt something was seriously wrong. As she lay beside him, she remembered their honeymoon on South Padre Island. The memory was a comforting escape. Steve woke up gradually, savoring the closeness. Their shared moment was intense and fulfilling. Afterward, they lay together, breathing heavily and enjoying the warmth. Eventually, Barbara turned to face the dark ceiling, and Steve chuckled softly, both feeling the bond they shared. Steve, feeling alive for the first time in months, realized how much he had missed this closeness. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. Barbara hesitated before responding, her voice trembling. "I don't want you to die and leave me alone." Steve, taken aback, touched her gently. He could sense her distress even in the dark. "Barbara, what's wrong?" he asked softly. "I can't imagine living without you," she whispered. Steve's heart sank. "Can you hold me? I'm so afraid," Barbara pleaded. Steve wrapped his arms around her. "You're not going to die," he reassured her. "I'm going to be here annoying you until we're both old and frail. Got it? You're not about to die, and neither am I." Barbara relaxed a bit. "But you've been so sick," she said, listing his recent ailments. Steve replied, "It's just been a flu and some work stress. I'm fine now. Maybe I overindulged on chips, but I'm okay." Steve got up and returned with a lamp and some papers. "I meant to tell you earlier," he said, waving the papers. "I'm not HIV positive. I've been tested, and it's been over 3 months with no signs. Dr. McMillan confirmed it today. My chances of having it are almost 0. Barbara looked at him, still processing. "You couldn't have told me earlier?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I was asleep and didn't know it was urgent," Steve said, adding, "I'm completely clean and the county health department has cleared Kim's partners too. There are no serious health issues among them." Barbara sighed in relief but felt foolish. "You must think I'm so foolish," she said, covering her eyes. "No, I don't think that," Steve said, turning off the light and getting back into bed. "We need to talk about how we're moving forward." Barbara, feeling safe in his arms, asked, "What are we going to do?" Steve replied, "We need to be honest about our situation and our plans. Remember our promise to talk about everything?" Barbara nodded, understanding the importance of their commitment. Barbara snuggled closer to Steve. "I don't think we've really made any progress," she said quietly. Steve acknowledged the challenges they faced but remained hopeful about working through them together. As dawn light filtered in, Steve felt conflicted. Despite caring for Barbara, he struggled with mixed feelings and lingering trust issues. He was wrestling with his own doubts and the sense of losing control over his life. "Let's revisit forgiveness tonight," suggested Verna Houston. Steve, who had been reflecting on his actions all day, hoped the discussion would bring clarity. Barbara, unsure of what to say, looked to Verna. "Forgiveness means accepting that good people can do bad things and feeling genuine remorse," she said slowly. Verna turned to Steve. "Do you agree with this definition?" Steve nodded, but added he still had questions. Verna focused on Barbara. "Have you asked Steve for forgiveness?" she asked gently. Steve quickly interjected. "She doesn't need to beg for it." Verna clarified. "I didn't say beg, I said ask." She looked at Barbara kindly. Barbara, nervously licking her lips, admitted, "I've made mistakes and feel truly sorry." Steve, feeling apprehensive, replied softly, "I forgive you for the pain you've caused and for your mistakes. I might not forget everything, but I accept your remorse." He squeezed her hand gently. Verna then asked Steve, "Have you asked Barbara for forgiveness?" Steve, gripping Barbara's hand, thought deeply. "I'm sorry for hurting your view of your sister. I felt I had to act but regret how I did it," he said slowly. "I should have handled it differently and communicated better." He continued, "I also regret how I acted towards you, Barbara. I wanted you to feel my pain, but it was wrong. I thought I might push you away for good. I wasn't sure if I wanted that or if I just stopped caring." Steve took a deep breath. "I know my actions were wrong, and I wish I hadn't acted that way." Barbara, calm and resolute, replied, "I forgave you before our first counseling session. I saw how tough it was for you, and it's not something I hold on to anymore." Steve was surprised. "You never wondered why?" Barbara responded, "I did, but I chose to focus on understanding and moving forward." Steve looked into Barbara's eyes and said, "I don't think about divorce anymore. I was foolish to try and get back at you. It's all in the past." Barbara agreed, but she felt uneasy. She wanted to make progress, but was cautious not to rush him. Lydia, with a reassuring smile, said, "I think you've got your man back. He's yours again." Barbara was doubtful. She knew there were still issues to resolve. Lydia noticed Barbara's concern and asked, "What's troubling you?" Barbara hesitated before revealing, "Steve said he was really happy a few months after our honeymoon. Why would he say that?" Lydia responded gently, "Perhaps he meant it." Relationships have ups and downs. Barbara, feeling uncomfortable, admitted, "Our recent moments together have been lovely. He's been caring and attentive, but we haven't had much alone time since our honeymoon." Lydia, intrigued, asked, "When was the last time you two had a moment alone?" Barbara blushed, whispering, "Almost since our honeymoon." Lydia laughed softly and said, "Is it too personal to talk about?" Barbara shook her head, feeling overwhelmed. "Steve might think you're not open to affection," Lydia explained. "If you don't show your feelings, he might stop trying. Why not take the first step and be more open?" Barbara, her face red, admitted she hadn't been very affectionate lately. Lydia suggested, "Showing love doesn't have to be extravagant. Even simple gestures can make a difference. How about starting with something small?" Barbara nodded eagerly. "I really want to feel closer to him. We've only had a few moments since I moved back." Lydia smiled and said, "It's not too late. A little spark might be all you need to reconnect. Let's work on it together." Barbara sighed. "Okay, I'll come with you," she said, reluctantly following her grandmother upstairs. Lydia opened her dresser drawer and pulled out a few items, some of which Barbara recognized. "If you tell your mom about these, she might want to borrow them," Lydia warned with a chuckle. Barbara was taken aback. "Nana, what's all this?" Lydia smiled knowingly. "There's a lot you need to learn. Take these videos and watch them. You'll get a few ideas." Barbara hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or hide her eyes. She picked up a strange blue plastic item. "What's this?" "That's a special item," Lydia explained. "You need to be open-minded. From what I know, you're the only girl in the family not exploring this stuff." Barbara sat on the bed, feeling overwhelmed. "Did Mom tell you this?" Lydia nodded. "We're doing this the wrong way. We need to go straight to the source." She began putting everything back in the drawer. "Do you have your car and credit card? We're going to a bookstore near the Loop." Barbara, feeling a bit nervous, quickly followed her grandmother down the stairs. Meanwhile, Steve and Elaine were having coffee. Their meetings had become shorter, and Steve had finally decided to proceed with the divorce paperwork he had delayed since November. "That's good," Elaine said, excited. "It's about time you moved on." Steve was taken aback by her reaction. "You don't want Barbara to face a messy divorce?" Elaine replied. "I don't want to see her hurt any more than she has been. She's tried hard to change." Steve nodded, understanding that Elaine was genuinely concerned. They discussed their personal struggles. Elaine's husband, Rafe, was no longer running for city council and had turned down a job offer to spend more time with his family. "I'm glad he's focusing on being a better father and husband," Elaine said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "He's doing well on that front, at least for now." Steve gently covered Elaine's hand. "You need to be there for him so he can spend more time with you and your daughter," he said. "Yes," Elaine agreed gratefully. "This is the last time we'll talk like this?" Steve asked. "Yes," Elaine said, her sadness evident. Steve smiled softly and patted her hand. "I'm happy for you, Elaine. Really." They chatted for another 20 minutes, wrapping up various topics. When their coffee was gone, they left a tip and hugged outside the cafe. A policewoman who saw them thought they were siblings saying goodbye, making for a touching scene. "I'm impressed by how far you've come in a month," the counselor said. "You're talking again, which is great. Let's meet every 2 or 3 weeks and see how it goes." Barbara and Steve exchanged a glance. Barbara seemed okay with it. "That sounds good," Steve agreed. "We can adjust if needed." "Perfect," Verna said, setting up the schedule. "Is Thursday evening still good?" After Verna left to fix the intercom, Steve and Barbara were alone. "We don't need to discuss serious matters in front of him, right?" Steve asked. Barbara shook her head. "We're adults. We can take breaks if needed." Steve nodded. "I agree." Barbara attempted to start a conversation. "Kim called this morning from Dallas." "Really? When?" Steve asked, surprised. "She called before I went to work." "She's okay now and grateful for your help," Barbara explained. "She's been getting counseling and wants to thank you for caring." Steve sighed. "I still feel bad about how I treated her and spoke to your parents." Barbara patted his hand. "They've forgiven you. You know that." "I know," Steve said. "But I wish they'd share their feelings with me. They seemed more understanding at Christmas," Barbara reassured him. "Dad hired an investigator to ensure Kim's problems were handled. No more videos showed up online. It's all being forgotten." Steve nodded, then asked, "You've been spending a lot of time with her lately?" "Yes. Barbara admitted, a hint of nervousness in her voice. She's good for me. Steve smiled. I like her too. Verna returned and confirmed the new schedule. We'll meet every third Thursday for the next 2 months. What do you want to discuss tonight? Barbara and Steve looked at each other, ready to begin. Steve shifted uneasily in his seat. Do you have any questions on your mind? He asked. Barbara shook her head firmly. Let's address everything now, Steve. We don't want surprises 10 years from now because we avoided talking about it. Okay, Steve replied slowly. I understand most of it. I see how vulnerable you felt at times. It hurts, but I accept that you didn't feel you could share your doubts with me. I think we need to talk more about that later. Barbara nodded. What troubles me most is when you thought it was okay to be involved with those men after we married. I just can't believe it. Steve seemed taken aback. Don't you remember Thad Brown before we were married? Barbara asked. Steve thought for a moment. I remember him, he said. But that was before we married. You convinced me you'd said goodbye to him. We'd broken up and hadn't seen each other for 6 months. I don't think about him like I do about Jimmy Roberts and Raphael Porter. Barbara nodded. Thank you. I thought Thad wasn't an issue anymore. I knew it was Jimmy and Rafe who were still on your mind. She took Steve's hand, feeling comfortable now. I never intended to be with anyone else. It's still tough to talk about. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't think about the cost. I was focused on getting emotional support for what was bothering me, not on the consequences. I didn't realize you were there for me. She paused, bracing herself. It wasn't a single moment of choosing to be unfaithful. It built up over time, 100 small steps. I was lost, especially after my miscarriage. I let other men flatter me and offer support. You stopped Jimmy before I made a bigger mistake, but I wish you'd done the same with Rafe. I was wrong not to listen to you. Barbara's eyes met Steve's. I thought you were only saying those things because you had to. I didn't understand why I thought that. I was immature and insecure. I didn't realize our relationship needed work. I believed happily ever after just happened. When we first fought, I felt lost and didn't know how to handle it. Growing up, I only saw my parents getting along and didn't know how to work through disagreements. Barbara took a deep breath. Can we go back a moment? You're curious about why I made those choices, even when I knew they were wrong. Do you remember the stoplight? Steve looked puzzled, but then remembered it was over 6 years ago. Mr. Houston, the counselor, listened closely. A lot of these feelings are common in troubled relationships. People often talk about confusion and feeling alone, not realizing the impact of their actions. Barbara delved into a memory she hadn't shared before. Steve, remember the stoplight incident when we were dating? Steve nodded. We were heading to a picnic, and at a small intersection you ran a red light. It was unusual for you since you were always a cautious driver. Barbara continued. You seemed surprised and upset when we pointed it out. You didn't even remember running the light. It was like you acted without thinking. Steve leaned back, reflecting. I didn't think about it then. I didn't remember making the decision to run the light. I thought maybe I didn't see any cars and just went through, but I'm not sure. He sighed. It bothers me that sometimes actions are taken without careful thought. I've never run a red light since then. I keep that memory to ensure I don't make the same mistake again. Barbara squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. I understand, Steve. I hate that part of me that made those choices. I'll always remember the past to stay on the right path. Steve studied Barbara's face, touched by her honesty. I see your point. I'll accept this, even if it's hard. I know it makes sense. He turned to Mr. Houston. Have I gone through the steps of grief you mentioned? Mr. Houston smiled. Yes, Steve, you have. And you've done it well. Steve nodded. So, should we move on to the smaller issues? Barbara's phone call interrupted them. Hi, Steve. Are you alone? Steve replied, Lois and Jeff are out for lunch. Why? Barbara asked. Is the door locked? No, it's not locked, honey. Why do you ask? Steve said. Barbara's voice was a bit shaky. No one can see your laptop screen from the door or windows, right? Steve, puzzled, responded, If I close the blinds, yeah. Please do, Barbara requested. Steve sighed and shut the blinds. Okay, they're closed. What's going on? Barbara's nervousness was palpable. You'll find out in a minute. Steve listened intently as Barbara continued. Do you remember June Wright and her nephew, the computer guy? Yes, I remember, Steve said. Well, they helped me set up a webcam this morning, Barbara said, sounding more nervous. Steve was confused. Why a webcam? Just give me a moment, Barbara said. Can you type our IP address into Netscape and use port 11547? Steve did as asked. Curiosity piqued. Okay, it's loading. The firewall was blocking it, but I've let the connection through. He saw Barbara's cheerful face on the screen. Barbara, what's this about? Barbara waved at the camera with a big smile. Do you like it? Steve adjusted the screen, his curiosity growing. Yeah, but is this some kind of online show? Barbara laughed. Only for you, darling. Steve was speechless as Barbara continued to adjust the camera, revealing more. Wow. Barbara carefully set something down and said, Honey, how long until you're home? Steve grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. I'm on my way now. Did you turn off your computer? Barbara reminded him. Steve dashed back, closed his laptop, and ran outside, his heart racing. He sped home, screeching to a stop at the garage. Bursting through the door, he found Barbara waiting, her eyes shining with anticipation. Wow, Barbara, you look beautiful, Steve said, filled with admiration. Barbara's smile widened. Do you really think so? Yes, Steve said sincerely. You're amazing. Barbara reached for him, and they embraced warmly. Steve felt a deep connection and overwhelming love as they shared a heartfelt moment. Barbara's smile remained as they held each other close. We used to do this on our honeymoon, she said softly. Barbara paused, then gently said, It's not too late to start enjoying these moments again, is it? Steve smiled. No, it's not. Barbara grinned and moved closer, recalling their past closeness. They hugged, savoring the renewed bond. Come here, she said softly, taking his hand and leading him into the living room. They laughed, their relationship feeling lighter again. As they reached the couch, Barbara kissed Steve deeply and they embraced, missing the warmth they'd been missing. Remember when we used to relax on the sofa after the beach during our honeymoon? Barbara asked with a smile. Steve's eyes lit up. Oh, yes, I remember. Barbara settled on the couch, playfully asking, Do you see anything you like? Steve grinned, quickly removing his shoes, belt, and jacket. He moved closer, excited and happy. Barbara, are you sure you want this? Barbara nodded. I've been looking forward to this moment. Let's just enjoy being together. Steve wrapped his arms around her, feeling their strong bond and shared affection. They embraced deeply, finding comfort and reconnection. Barb, honey? Steve's voice was thick with emotion. Me too, Barbara replied, feeling the intensity of their shared feelings. They held each other tightly, savoring the warmth and connection. As the intensity faded, they lay together, catching their breath. Honey? Steve whispered. I don't know what just happened, but you can do that again anytime. Barbara chuckled softly. We will. We need to revisit all the things we used to do. We shouldn't have stopped. Steve agreed. What else should we do? Barbara suggested. We could explore every room in our house. I've heard that's something people do together. Steve responded. We can start with 1 or 2 rooms today and try new things. Barbara hesitated, then said, I found some things that might help with exploring new experiences. What kind of things? Steve asked, intrigued. Just some tools for trying new things together, Barbara explained. Are you okay with that? Absolutely, Steve said with excitement. I'm looking forward to it. Barbara smiled. Great. I'm excited for everything we can try, even going outside or camping. Steve laughed gently. Sweetheart, we can't do it all in one day. Okay, we have our whole lives for that, Steve said. Barbara snuggled close and, feeling thankful for their rebuilt bond, agreed cheerfully. They enjoyed the quiet moment until Barbara leaned in and whispered in Steve's ear, her warm breath tickling his cheek. But if you had to pick, what would you want to do first? Steve Curtis sat on the back deck, watching the sunset. Content with his life, he reflected on his new job, his improving marriage, and the crisp fall evening. Barbara hummed in the kitchen, preparing hot chocolate, a cozy end to their day. It had taken over 2 years to get here, with plenty of struggle along the way. Steve chuckled, remembering how counseling had pushed them through their difficulties. At a recent 4th of July picnic, Steve was surprised to see Barbara's grandmother chatting with his boss and finance head. Lydia revealed she had known them since childhood, making Steve laugh and realize why the company had eased its rules for senior married workers during their tough times. Counseling had helped them reconnect. They worked through Barbara's past decisions and insecurities, with Mr. Houston guiding them to better communication and understanding. Barbara grew more confident, and their bond strengthened. Barbara joined Steve on the patio, placing 2 cups of hot chocolate on the table. "Sweetheart," she began softly, "I think we should move the camping gear from the back room to the garage. What do you think?" Steve agreed, noting that the garage had more space. "What will we do with the room?" he asked. Barbara sipped her drink and suggested, "We could use it as a bedroom again." Steve was distracted by the sunset, but nodded. "We might need the space for a nursery," Barbara said cautiously. Steve took a moment to grasp her words. "What?" Barbara smiled. "In about 7.5 months." Steve's eyes widened. "Oh my gosh," Barbara asked with a hint of doubt. "Are you happy?" Steve pulled her close, his embrace saying everything. They continued to hold each other as the sun set, unaware of the rising darkness around them. Thanks for listening to One Infidelity Hit. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop us a like.